Chapter 5 Domesticated Animal Citizens. In this chapter, our aim is to spell out in more detail our citizenship model for domesticated animals. As suggested earlier, our approach rests on two main ideas. 1. Domesticated animals must be seen as members of our community. Having brought such animals into our society and deprived them of other possible forms of existence, at least for the foreseeable future, we have a duty to include them in our social and political arrangements on fair terms. As such, they have rights of membership, rights that go beyond the universal rights owed to all animals, and which are hence relational and differentiated. And 2. The appropriate conceptual framework for thinking about these relational membership rights is that of citizenship. Citizenship, in turn, has at least three core elements: residency, this is their home and they belong here; inclusion in the sovereign people, their interests count in determining the public good; and agency, they should be able to shape the rules of cooperation. In both respects, we've likened domestic animals to the case of former slaves, indentured laborers, and foreign migrants, who were initially brought into a community as a subordinated caste, but who rightly demanded inclusion in the we of political community. When we bring newcomers into our society on a permanent basis, we owe them and their descendants membership in the form of citizenship, above and beyond universal human rights. Our aim is to extend this principle to domesticated animals. To some extent, these two ideas are separable, and someone could accept the idea of membership rights for domesticated animals without accepting that citizenship provides an appropriate framework for conceptualizing these membership rights. One might think that while domesticated animals stand in morally significant relations with humans that generate relational membership rights, these cannot be the relations of co-citizenship. Indeed, as we have seen, animal rights theorists to date have been surprisingly reluctant to invoke the idea of citizenship in relation to domesticated animals, perhaps because citizenship seems to presuppose a set of capacities that many animals lack. Citizenship is often said to require a reflectively held sense of one's own good, and the ability to articulate that good within a democratic process, as well as a sense of justice, and the ability to comply with fair terms of cooperation that are themselves relationally negotiated and consensually endorsed. In this view, since animals lack such competencies, their membership could not take the form of citizenship, but could perhaps be conceptualized as wardship. The difference is that whereas citizens are active co-authors in the community's laws and institutions, wards are passive recipients of our duty to protect the vulnerable. In this chapter, we argue for the appropriateness of a citizenship model, but it is worth noting that both wardship and citizenship entail the idea of relational rights, and hence go beyond many existing animal rights theory. At the start of this book, we stated that our aim was to show the necessity of supplementing the universal rights defended by traditional animal rights theory with a differentiated theory of animal rights that tracks morally significant differences in the relations between animals and humans. Wardship is one possible framework for articulating a distinctive type of morally significant relationship, with its own rights and duties, beyond the respect for universal rights that are owed to all sentient animals. Indeed, wardship and citizenship are likely to generate similar conclusions, at least on some issues. For example, both wardship and citizenship are likely to say that we have duties to provide forms of care, such as medical interventions, to domesticated animals, which we do not have to wild or liminal animals. However, we want to argue strongly for the preferability of a citizenship model. We believe that the reluctance to conceive of domesticated animals as co-citizens is rooted, fundamentally, in two pernicious misunderstandings. First, there is an unwillingness to recognize the competencies of domesticated animals for agency, cooperation, and participation in mixed human-animal settings. As biologists have long recognized, animal species were selected for domestication precisely because of these competencies. The wardship model ignores these capacities and treats domesticated animals as wholly passive and dependent on humans. Second, and relatedly, there is an unwillingness to accept that humans and domesticated animals already form a mixed community that belongs to all its members. The wardship model, implicitly or explicitly, treats domesticated animals as a leftover or remainder, located on the literal and figural margins of human society, having no claims regarding how the broader community governs itself and its public spaces. It treats domesticated animals as something like protected aliens or guests who don't really belong here, but whom we have a duty to treat humanely. Our aim in this chapter is to show that a citizenship model better captures both the empirical realities and the moral imperatives of our relations with domesticated animals. To that end, we begin by exploring the sort of competencies that are required for citizenship. Drawing on recent work in disability theory, we show that there are many ways for individuals with varying levels of cognitive ability to be treated as citizens and to exercise their citizenship, and that there is no reason why domesticated animals cannot be included within these more expansive ideas of citizenship. We then explore what this citizenship model would mean for a range of specific issues, including the socialization and training of domesticated animals, their rights to mobility, their medical care and protection from harm, and their reproduction. In all of these cases, we argue that the citizenship model provides more plausible answers than either the abolitionist/extinctionist or threshold views that we discussed in Chapter 4. Section 1. Rethinking Citizenship. Can animals be citizens? As we discussed in Chapter 3, citizenship involves not just a list of rights or entitlements, but also an ongoing role as a co-creator of the community, participating collectively in the shaping of one's society and its culture and institutions. Citizenship is thus an active role in which individuals are contributing agents and not simply passive recipients of benefits. Such an active role clearly requires certain capacities, which we need to spell out explicitly. If we look at familiar accounts of citizenship in the human case, citizenship is often said to require at least 3 basic capacities, or what Rawls calls moral powers. 1. The capacity to have a subjective good and to communicate it. 2. The capacity to comply with social norms/cooperation. And 3. The capacity to participate in the co-authoring of laws. We do not dispute this basic list. We do, however, dispute the way in which these 3 capacities are typically interpreted. In most political philosophy, these capacities are interpreted in highly intellectualist or rationalist ways. For example, the capacity for a subjective good is seen as requiring that individuals reflectively endorse a conception of the good. It is not enough to have a good, you need to have a reflective good. Similarly, the capacity to comply with social norms is understood to require that individuals rationally understand the reasons for those norms and comply with them for those reasons. And the capacity to participate in the co-authoring of the law is understood as requiring that individuals be able to engage in public reason or other forms of communicative rationality that involve being able to articulate one's own reasons for defending certain laws and to understand and evaluate other people's reasons. It is not enough to cooperate in social life. You need to be able to reflect on and deliberate about the terms of cooperation. If interpreted in these highly cognitivist ways, then animals do seem incapable of being citizens. However, large numbers of human beings would also be excluded. Children, the mentally disabled, people with dementia, and those who are temporarily incompetent due to illness or injury. As a result, cognitivist restrictions on citizenship have progressively been challenged and abandoned, in large part due to the legal and political struggles of the disability movement, which has campaigned explicitly for citizenship rather than merely humanitarian protection. In the words of Michael Prince, quote, "Struggling for full citizenship is the paradigmatic form of political action," end quote, with the disability movement, whose activists have, quote, "adopted citizenship as the central organizing principle and benchmark," end quote. For people with mental disabilities, this challenge to the cognitivist conception of citizenship operates on 2 levels, both of which are highly relevant for the animal case. First, the disability movement insists on the capacities the mentally disabled actually have. For example, the capacity to have a subjective good, to communicate that good, to participate and co-create public life, and to form relations of trust and cooperation, and on the continuities between these abilities and those of the abled. Second, the movement has reconceived how these capacities can sustain the recognition and exercise of citizenship. For example, how those with mental disabilities can enact their citizenship, at least under appropriate conditions. At the heart of these new accounts of the capacities for citizenship is the idea of trust-based dependent agency. In this view, even the severely cognitively disabled have the capacity for agency, but it is agency that is exercised in and through relations with particular others in whom they trust, and who have the skills and knowledge needed to recognize and assist the expression of agency. Where such supportive and trusting relations exist, those with mental disabilities have the requisite capacities for citizenship, including 1. The capacity to express their subjective good, as revealed through various forms of behavior and communication. 2. The capacity to comply with social norms through the evolution of trusting relationships. And 3. The capacity to participate in shaping terms of interaction. We spell out some of these ideas in more detail below, since in our view they are applicable to domesticated animals. Indeed, one of the important facts about the process of domestication is that it presupposes and reinforces precisely these sorts of capacities for dependent agency. Domestication only works for animals that are sociable, able to communicate and to adapt and trust humans, and domestication over time has worked to strengthen these capacities. As a result, domesticated animals are capable of forming relations with humans that allow them to manifest a subjective good, to cooperate, and to participate. In short, to be citizens. Not all animals have the sorts of relations with human beings that enable this sort of dependent agency, and hence citizenship. Indeed, in the following 2 chapters, we argue that such relations do not exist and should not exist for a wide range of non-domesticated animals, whether living in the wild or amongst us in the liminal zone. For such animals, we need to find alternative ways of recognizing their rights and interests other than by according them citizenship in our shared political community. For domesticated animals, however, citizenship is both possible, we argue, and morally required. Section 2. Recent disability theories of citizenship. Before examining the case of domesticated animals in more detail, we'd like to briefly explore the important new literature on disability theory with regard to citizenship for people with severe intellectual disabilities, hereafter SID, since our own ideas have been strongly shaped by it. As we noted, this literature raises 2 profound challenges to traditional citizenship theory. It calls upon us to recognize the capacities that already exist amongst people with SID, and calls upon us to recognize ways in which those capacities can sustain practices of citizenship. The first is the capacity to have a subjective good, and the ability to communicate it. Theorists emphasize that people with SID have projects and preferences, even if they lack, quote, the more specific abilities required to form judgments about their own interests, end quote, and even if they are unable to articulate their subjective good without the assistance of others. In order to communicate this good, various models of dependent agency have been developed. For example, Eva Feder-Kitte emphasizes the role of caregivers in achieving a kind of transparency for communicating the preferences of people with SID through intimate acquaintance and careful, loving attention. This may involve the interpretation of body language and subtleties of expression, gesture, and sound. As Francis and Silvers put it, quote, the collaborator's role is to attend to these expressions, to fit them together into an account of ongoing preferences that constitutes a personalized idea of the good, and to work out how to realize this good under existing circumstances. End quote. John Vorhaus provides the example of Kaylee, a child with SID. She cannot answer a question about how she wants to spend her day. However, shown pictures representing different options, she is able to gesture to indicate a preference. Whereas traditional theories assume that a subjective good for people with SID either does not exist or is inaccessible and therefore cannot be a basis for citizenship, disability theory argues that this dismissal is an artifact of undue reliance on linguistic models of articulation, and an overly individualistic and internal conception of how we arrive at our understanding of the subjective good. With the right enabling conditions in place, the subjective good for people with SID can be articulated and can help to shape our conceptions of justice. Citizenship is not just about articulating or advancing one's own good. It is also about the ability to consent to and comply with fair terms of cooperation. Traditional theories of justice frequently invoke the idea of negotiating a social contract as a way of envisioning how we come to agreement about the principles of justice. We first engage in rational debate about the appropriate terms of cooperation, and then, having collectively endorsed the preferred principles of justice, we comply with those principles and do so for the right reasons. This model obviously won't work for people with SID. But as Silvers and Francis note, there are alternatives to this negotiation model of how social cooperation develops. They propose instead a trust model, in which parties first develop trusting relations with particular others, and through the evolution of these trusting relations come to participate in the shaping and sustaining of larger cooperative schemes. In the traditional negotiation model, the parties, quote, are portrayed as articulating, examining, and then selecting basic principles, end quote, which are then immediately put in place. The trust model, by contrast, quote, emphasizes that cooperation facilitating conditions develop over time as social activity evolves to exemplify principles of cooperation that strengthen and systematize people's natural proclivities to depend on each other. People need not be able to articulate these principles or to ponder them to be committed to them, end quote. This trust model begins with the, quote, discretionary commitment to trusting each other by parties whose capabilities differ, end quote. But these particular interactions, quote, enrich another kind of entity, the cooperative scheme or the social climate, the community culture, or society itself, end quote. In this trust model, people with SID can both assent to and comply with schemes of social cooperation, envisioned as a process of enacting and revising social norms in the context of ongoing cooperating relationships, rather than a one-time negotiation. People with SID participate in and enrich the cooperative scheme through their relationships of love, trust, and mutual dependency, capacities which are overlooked by traditional models of citizenship participation. This is just a brief sketch of recent theorizing on citizenship for people with intellectual disabilities. But we can already see the seeds of a new and more inclusive conception of citizenship. In the traditional account, people with SID are either entirely ignored or treated as outliers or marginal cases to be incorporated as moral patients, subject to permanent wardship in accordance with social norms that they have no role in shaping. With this new approach, citizenship is reconceived to enable individuals with a much broader range of capabilities to act as and to be treated as full citizens. And this in turn requires treating citizens as distinct and unique individuals, rather than just as instances of some generic category. Respecting people as citizens means attending to their subjective good, rather than treating them according to some list of objective goods or capacities decided without reference to the person's own expressed wishes, and attending to their individualized capacities, rather than making global judgments of competence or incompetence based on a generic diagnosis of disability, without reference to a specific person's actual abilities to negotiate this or that particular challenge in life. To treat someone as a citizen is to look for evidence of their subjective individualized good, and to look for and support areas of individual agency. The main virtue of this approach is its capacity to extend justice and membership to a historically subordinated group. But it's worth noting that this approach arguably offers a more accurate account of what citizenship means for all of us. All of us need the help of others to articulate our subjective good. All of us need the help of supportive social structures to participate in schemes of social cooperation. We are all interdependent, relying on others to enable and sustain our variable and contextual capacities for agency. This indeed is a central point emphasized within the disability movement. We can learn something important about the human condition generally by exploring how identity and agency can be supported for those with mental disabilities. Acknowledging the facts of dependency should not be seen as an embarrassment to theories that stress the moral importance of autonomy and subjective identity, but as an opportunity to enrich such theories by highlighting the many ways in which social relationships and social structures either enable or inhibit these values. As Francis and Silvers put it, the facts of interdependency, quote, do not bring with them a loss of individuality or difference. To the contrary, understanding that subjective accounts can be achieved rather than precluded or marred through dependent agency enriches the way we think about the good. End quote. Similarly, Barbara Arnile notes that since we are all highly dependent on structures that enable us to function independently, dependency should be seen, quote, not as an antonym of autonomy, but as in some sense its precursor. End quote. An adequate theory of citizenship needs to explain how we enable agency in light of our varying forms and degrees of dependency, rather than simply wishing the facts of dependency away. In other words, the significance of this new model of interdependent citizenship isn't simply to expand the circle of individuals encompassed by citizenship theory, but to change our conception of citizenship for everyone, regardless of dependency status and innate capacities. Rather than dividing the polity between those who are independent and those who are dependent, or into those who are agents and those who are patients, this new conception of citizenship recognizes that we are all interdependent and experience varying forms and degrees of agency according to context and over the life course. Bringing people with SID into the realm of citizenship not only alters our conception of their capacities, because it forces us to establish enabling conditions in which their capacities can be recognized and fostered, it also highlights the ways in which capacities of the rest of the population are not simply innate, but socially enabled. Section 3. Can domesticated animals be citizens? These new conceptions of citizenship arising from disability theory have important implications for how we think about domesticated animals, since they offer a model of how the core capabilities of citizenship can be enacted without rational reflection. Individuals with SID can be citizens. They can have and communicate a subjective good. They can comply with schemes of social cooperation, and they can participate as agents in social life without being capable of rational reflection. If so, can domesticated animals also exercise these capacities and thereby be citizens? Our answer is yes. In a way, this should now be obvious. As we noted earlier, the animal species that were historically selected for domestication were picked precisely because they possessed these competencies. But given the novelty of thinking of animals as citizens, it may be worth reviewing the evidence. Having and expressing a subjective good. Anyone who has lived with a domesticated animal knows that they have preferences, interests, and desires, and that they communicate these in a variety of intentional ways. They walk to the gate to indicate that they want to go outside. They meow in front of the fridge to ask for food. They nuzzle your arm to ask for affection. They charge at you with flapping wings and squawking to tell you to back off. They drag a leash from the cupboard to signal walk time. They bow to invite you to play. They point towards the couch or bed to ask if it's okay to jump up. They come to a halt if you've inadvertently taken a wrong turn while walking with them through the park. They walk across the field and nuzzle your pocket to ask for an apple treat. They mass at a barn door to indicate that they want to get out of the rain. Through a vast repertoire of vocalizations, gestures, movements, and signals, domesticated animals tell us what they want and need from us. This communicating of their subjective good requires that we attend to them and learn to understand their ways of communicating. First, we must recognize that animals are trying to communicate, and then we need to observe carefully to interpret individual repertoires, and finally we need to respond appropriately, confirming for the animal that attempts to communicate with us are not a wasted effort. Over time, through a collaborative process of recognition and response, knowledge, trust, and expectation increase and repertoires expand. This is a classic instance of dependent agency. If we start from the premise that animals lack agency, and so do not attend to their signals, this belief becomes self-fulfilling as animals give up their attempts. However, the more that agency is expected and enabled, the greater the resulting capacity to express their subjective good. Consider some examples. Many humans think that their dog companions aren't fussy about what they eat, or that even if they are, it is up to humans to assert control over their diet. A paternalistic frame reigns. But while some paternalism is inevitable, we exercise far more control over animals' lives than is necessary for their safety. It's true that humans need to ensure that dogs meet their nutritional needs and that they don't overeat or eat foods that will poison them. But this still leaves a large area in which dogs can express their food preferences and make their own choices. Through trial and error and choice amongst options, it became perfectly clear to us that our dog Cody's favorite foods included fennel, kale stems, and carrots, and peas were so prized he simply helped himself to the veggie garden. Fruit really wasn't of interest. On the other hand, his buddy Raleigh was mad for bananas. Dogs have individual preferences, and to varying degrees, the competence to make choices based on their preferences. Our friend Christine is a great walker, and she and her late dog companion Julius spent hours on their daily outings. Christine was always of the view that these walks were for Julius, that they constituted his special time of the day, and that as much as possible she should defer to his wishes about what route to walk, how long to walk, whether to play along the way, whether to swim in the river, and so on. Julius usually walked off-leash and simply led the way. If he fell behind to snop and sniff, and meanwhile Christine came to a decision point in the route and chose the wrong way, then he would stop at the decision point and sit and wait until she looked back, recognized her mistake, and turned back to join him on his chosen route for the day. In other words, not only did he exercise route choice, but he understood that this was his prerogative. Food choices and walk choices may seem like trivial matters in the context of thinking about citizenship, but are they really? In the life of a dog companion, wouldn't questions about what you eat and how you spend the most active parts of your day in fact be of enormous importance? What are the outer limits of this potential scope for agency? That's not a question that can be answered in the abstract. It can only be answered by engaging in the process, expecting agency, looking for agency, and enabling agency. And indeed, there have been some remarkable examples of people who have gone much further in exploring the possible scope for dogs and other domesticated animals to exercise agency. Barbara Smuts describes her relationship with Safi, the dog she adopted from an animal shelter. Smuts didn't train Safi, but very patiently communicated with her, repeated signs, and attended to Safi's signals in return. Quote, Safi understands, in the sense of responding appropriately to, many English phrases, and she in turn has patiently taught me to understand her language of gestures and postures. She rarely uses vocal communication. Some dogs bark when they want to go out, but Safi instead gazes at the door, even if she's standing far away, and then looks at me. It took me a while to catch on. If we're out walking and I become too absorbed in my own thoughts or in talking with other people, she regains my attention by gently touching her nose to the back of my leg in that sensitive spot behind the knee. As I write this paragraph, she leaves the spot where she's been resting for the last hour and gently prods my elbow with her nose, signaling a desire to connect. When I approach her with a similar desire, she's nearly always willing to pause in her activities to attend to me, and I do the same for her. I stop typing, meet her gaze, say her name, and brush the top of her head with my lips. Apparently fulfilled by this brief contact, she leaves me uninterrupted for another hour or two, a restraint specific to those times when I am writing. End quote. Elizabeth Marshall Thomas has also engaged in a lengthy project of figuring out how to respect the agency of her dog companions. In The Hidden Life of Dogs, she provides detailed observations of their individual capacities and choices when given scope for agency, rather than being trained to conform to her expectations. Quote, to the dogs who stayed with me, I gave food, water, and shelter. But after my project began, I made no effort to train them, even for housebreaking or coming when called. I didn't need to. The young dogs copied the old dogs, which in their case resulted in perfect housebreaking, and all the dogs naturally came when called most of the time, declining to do so only if our demands conflicted with something that was genuinely important to them. A dog who feels free to make such a distinction shows more of his thoughts and feelings in a single day than a rigidly trained, hyper-disciplined dog can show in a lifetime. End quote. Thomas found significant individual variation amongst her dogs in terms of capabilities and preferences about how and with whom to spend their time. The dogs were often allowed to roam and explore freely around the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Misha was a master navigator, going on long journeys without ever getting lost or running into difficulty coping with cars and other dangers of city life. Maria also loved to roam, but, a hopeless navigator, she inevitably got lost when she wasn't with Misha. Her solution was to wait on the porch of a house until someone noticed her, checked her tags, and called Thomas to come and collect her. This proved a reliable mechanism which Maria depended on often. It's a classic instance of dependent agency. Maria loves to roam, but can't navigate, so the solution is to find humans to play key enabling roles as a kind of scaffold to support her autonomy. The capacity for agency is not restricted to companion animals. Farm animals are also capable of expressing their subjective good. Rosamund Young has spent decades observing the cows and other animals on her family's farm in Worcestershire, their friendships and enmities, their individual preferences across the range of activities, their distinctive personalities and intelligences. Kite's Nest Farm offers, quote, an environment which allows all of the animals the freedom to communicate with or disassociate themselves from us as they choose, end quote. In the space created by this freedom, individual personality and agency emerge. Quote, for many years we have noticed that if you give cows the opportunity and the time to choose between several alternatives, for instance between staying outside or coming in for shelter, or walking on grass or on straw or on concrete, or a choice of diet, then they will choose what is best for them, and they will not all choose the same thing. The decision-making process animals are constantly involved in includes choosing exactly what to eat. Nibbling and browsing all sorts of different grasses, herbs, flowers, hedges, and tree leaves gives them vital trace elements in their daily diet in the amounts they feel are appropriate. Such decisions could not be made so effectively by us. The animals are all individuals. Mass legislation for the entire herd in terms of feed might suit the majority, but we have always been concerned with minorities. We have watched cows and sheep eat extraordinary plants in prodigious qualities. Cows will eat dark green, vicious-looking, stinging nettles by the cubic yard, and sheep often choose pointy, spiky thistled tops or tall, tough dock leaves, particularly after parturition when their energy reserves are depleted. One particularly satisfying fact we have discovered is that if the animals have sustained an injury, they like to eat quite large quantities of willow. We hope that this is connected to the origins of aspirin. End quote. All of these writers provide compelling accounts of dependent agency, agency which arises out of respectful relationship. Mutz describes this respect in terms of a relationship between equals, between persons. Quote, relating to other beings as persons has nothing to do with whether or not we attribute human characteristics to them. It has to do with, instead, recognizing that they are social subjects like us, whose idiosyncratic subjective experience of us plays the same role in their relations with us that our subjective experience of them plays in our relations with them. If they relate to us as individuals, and we relate to them as individuals, it's possible for us to have a personal relationship. If either party fails to take into account the other's social subjectivity, such a relationship is precluded. Thus, while we normally think of personhood as an essential quality that we can discover or fail to find in another, in the view espoused here, personhood connotes a way of being in relation to others, and thus no one other than the subject can give it or take it away. In other words, when a human being relates to an individual non-human being as an anonymous object, rather than as a being with its own subjectivity, it is the human, and not the other animal who relinquishes personhood. End quote. Domesticated animals may not reflect on the good, but they have a good, interests, preferences, desires, and an ability to act or communicate in order to achieve their good. Recall Arnyll's claim that dependency is a precursor to autonomy, not its antonym. Domesticated animals are dependent on humans to establish a basic framework of security and comfort for them. With this framework in place, they are capable of exercising agency in many areas of their lives, either directly, as when the cows choose which plants they need to eat, or through supported agency, as when Maria uses her sit on a stranger's porch routine to muster up her drive home. Political participation. So animals have and can express a subjective good. But can this be translated into political participation? Participation is linked to the idea that citizens consent to being democratically governed. In traditional views, this is conceived primarily in terms of the responsibility to be informed, to participate in elections on the basis of this information, and to thereby help shape the shared political community. Once again, we see the strong rationalist inflection at work in this conception of citizenship participation as an intellectual process of rational reflection, negotiation, and consent. Earlier, we noted that disability advocates have offered a different conception of political participation, one that reconceives participation and assent in more embodied terms. Clifford notes how the sheer presence of people with SID alters the political process and debate. Silvers and Francis propose a trust model in place of the negotiation model of social contract, in which citizens participate in and shape the political community by engaging in social relationships. In other words, assent is reconceived in terms of the continuation of an ongoing relationship of trust rather than a fixed in-time agreement. Can we see domesticated animals in this picture? Much has been written about the invisibility of domesticated animals in modern society. A casual glance at a 19th century newspaper underscores the change. The papers are filled with accounts of unruly cows and pigs running amok in towns and cities. The history of industrialized agriculture is a history of the gradual separation of domesticated animals from human spaces, increasing restriction and confinement, and gradual removal of animals from the center to the periphery of urban areas. Cities and towns have passed ever more restrictive bylaws to regulate domesticated animal bodies, including animal companions. The latter are more visible than farm animals, but their mobility and access to have been significantly curtailed. In recent years, there has been a growing challenge to this trend towards confinement and invisibility. People are starting to keep backyard chickens, for example, and challenging bylaws that prevent them from having pigs as companions. The trend is most apparent in the case of dog companions and the burgeoning movement demanding access for them to off-leash parks, public transportation, and holiday destinations. The invisibility and exclusion of domesticated animals has parallels in the history of people with disabilities. The move towards separation, confinement, and invisibility in the 19th century, countered by the late 20th century demands for reintegration, mobility, and access. When people with disabilities were rendered invisible from the public sphere, the shape of the political community was altered. Absent bodies could no longer act as a corrective presence or a shaping force in political life. It is no coincidence that the escalation of separation and invisibility coincided with the height of the eugenics movement and the most egregious assaults on the rights of people with disabilities. The modern disability movement is focused on issues of reintegration and access, not just because of the difference this makes to the lives of particular individuals, but because the way the presence of people with disabilities alters our conception of the political community and institutions and structures of communal life. Sheer presence, in other words, constitutes a form of participation. When we think about the growing movement challenging leash laws and a variety of other restrictions controlling access and movement of dogs in public spaces, we might be inclined to conceptualize this advocacy in terms of human citizenship. It is humans who are doing the advocacy on behalf of themselves and their dogs. Humans are the agents here, doing the articulating and advocating. Dogs are the objects of agency, not the agents themselves. But this is to miss the way in which dogs, by their sheer presence, are advocates and agents of change. Consider some examples. North Americans who travel in Europe, especially France, are often struck by the presence of dogs in public spaces. Dogs travel on buses and trains. They accompany their humans to movie theaters, shops, and restaurants. In North America, this sort of integration of animals in public spaces is strictly limited by a range of bylaws justified primarily on the grounds of public health and safety. Now, if you've never traveled to France, you might unthinkingly accept the standard justifications for this exclusion of animals. You might believe that if dogs were integrated into public spaces, there would be epidemics of disease and injury. But then you travel to France and see the dogs everywhere, and you see that civilization hasn't collapsed, and you are forced to reconsider the highly restrictive treatment of animals back home. Notice in this scenario that the change in attitude is not the result of human advocacy. it is not necessary for the North American to have a conversation with the French citizen about the integration of dogs in their society. The dogs themselves, by their presence, are agents of change. They are not deliberate agents, but they are agents, leading their lives, doing the things they do, and because this agency is exercised in the public realm, it serves as a catalyst for political deliberation. A similar process is happening within North America through the agency of service dogs. Formerly strict prohibitions on dogs are being relaxed to allow service dogs who assist people with disabilities or who perform other services for humans. The justification for integration of these dogs is to benefit humans, but the impact of their presence is often to raise doubts about more general restrictions on dogs. It becomes much harder to cling to ideas about the dangers of dogs in public spaces when you regularly witness the opposite. In this way, service dogs are acting as agents in the public sphere, altering attitudes and changing the terms of public debate. In fact, the category of service dog is becoming a site of civil disobedience in the struggle for social reintegration. In a town in eastern Ontario, the owners of a local cheese shop have a companion dog, Justine, who likes to hang out at the shop. This would normally contravene local health bylaws, but Justine has false service dog credentials, indicating that she warns her humans of impending epileptic seizures, and on these grounds Justine is allowed to accompany her human into otherwise restricted areas. In this way, by her embodied presence, Justine educates the cheese shop customers that she is not a menace to their health, but a welcome addition to society. A fascinating account of dogs as political participants and agents of change is described by Jennifer Wolch in her discussion of urban dog park activism. A public park has become a hangout for drug users and prostitutes, abandoned by families and others intimidated by the presence of illegal activity. Then it was taken back by an informal group of dog owners, quote, who invested in improvements and security and used the presence of large off-leash dogs illegally to discourage less desirable uses. Paradoxically, just as the park became more attractive, other local residents signaled their desire to use the park, but objected to off-leash dogs, framing the issue as dogs versus kids. Dog owners prevailed in part by normalizing dogs as legitimate members of the American family and urban community. Like other urban dog parks, this park is now a distinctive place for both people and animals, and remains a locus for grassroots participation in the governance of urban park and recreation facilities. End quote. Humans are essential enablers in this story, but it couldn't have happened without the participation of dogs. Their physical presence and actions played a key role in the political process, resulting not only in their reintegration into public life and space, but in a more general change to grassroots activism in the city. The fact that dogs cannot reflect about the goals of activism or their role in it doesn't change the fact that they are participants in the process, and they are not coerced or captive participants. They are agents, doing what they want to do, exploring, playing, hanging out with their human and dog friends, and by virtue of being present and carrying on their lives, helping to shape the shared community with humans. This theme is explored in a recent study on the ripple effect of companion animals on community ethos and interactions. The presence of companion animals increases social interactions in communities, for example, when dogs act as an icebreaker to conversation. Their presence prompts reciprocal relations between neighbors, such as helping out by feeding the goldfish when the family goes on vacation. Because humans and their dog companions have a presence on the streets and in parks, they increase community members' sense that they live in a vibrant, cohesive, and safe neighborhood. And finally, companion animals serve as a spur for their humans to participate in community activities. In these myriad ways, companion animals actively foster contact, trust, and reciprocity within communities, the essential glue of citizenship relations. Political participation also includes protest and dissent. Jason Hrebal has explored this dimension of working animals' political agency, including actions such as work stoppages and slowdowns, destruction of equipment, escape attempts, and violence. Indeed, Hrebal argues that part of the explanation for the rapid transition from horsepower to the internal combustion engine in the early 20th century lies in industrial management's desire to be rid of a disruptive workforce who regularly challenge their working conditions. Hrebal also examines resistance amongst zoo and circus animals. He argues that zoo/circus authorities have deliberately mislabeled resistance actions by elephants, dolphins, and primates as unintentional accidents or random and instinctive behaviors, ignoring the obvious intent and planning involved. Authorities are well aware that public support for their institutions would be undermined by revelations that animals are desperate to escape their situation and engaged in active resistance. Cooperation, self-regulation, and reciprocity. Citizens are engaged in the cooperative project of social life. This means that they must engage in various forms of self-restraint in terms of their actions, their demands, and expectations, in order to foster mutual cooperation and trust. Put colloquially, citizenship is about responsibilities as well as rights, including the responsibility to comply with fair terms of cooperation. As noted, traditional citizenship theory puts a rationalist inflection on the idea of reciprocity. It is not enough to regulate your behavior in ways that foster social cooperation. You are supposed to do this for the right reasons. That is, out of concern for justice and respect for your fellow citizens. However, self-control, compliance with social norms, and cooperative behavior are all possible without rational reflection. Rational reflection is only sometimes part of the mix, and is always a matter of degree, varying enormously between individuals and for the same individual in different contexts. Political philosophy typically idealizes reciprocal behavior motivated by rational reflection, but in terms of the ongoing functioning of society, it is the behavior, not the motivation, that matters the most. Most of us go through our daily lives respecting social norms forbidding violence, theft, or harassment of others. Social life is only possible because we all know and respect these norms by and large. Much of the time, our conformity to these norms is completely unreflective. We do it unconsciously, automatically, habitually. If we are given to philosophizing, we may occasionally sit back and examine these practices, and changing circumstances might prompt us to pause and reflect. However, it would be paralyzing if we stopped to reflect all the time about the ethics of our actions. Most ethical behavior is habitual. This is particularly striking in the case of heroic moral action. People who have risked their lives to save others, running into a burning house, jumping into a freezing river, breaking cover to help a fallen comrade, often say that they did not stop to reflect. They responded directly to a situation of need in which they perceived they could act. We consider these people moral heroes. Moral action is not just about doing things out of commitment to abstract justifications. It is about moral character and action, and motivations such as love, compassion, and fear and loyalty. We all know people who think very carefully about the nature of morality, and yet are quite selfish in their relationships or social actions. We all know people who engage in unstinting and altruistic social action, and yet are not at all interested in reflecting on the ethics of their conduct. In the human case, we recognize that morality is deeply complex in this way, involving questions of motive, both rational and emotive, character, action, and consequence. When it comes to animals, however, we focus on just one aspect, rational reflection, and conclude that because animals seem incapable of reflecting on the nature of the good, they are not moral agents. Even in much of the animal advocacy literature, it is assumed that animals are moral patients, the object of moral action by humans, and never moral agents themselves. This view is strongly challenged by recent findings in the science of animal behavior, which shows that animals experience a wide range of emotions and exhibit a range of moral behaviors, such as empathy, trust, altruism, reciprocity, and a sense of fair play. The existence of cooperative and altruistic behavior amongst animals is not particularly controversial. We all know that wolves and killer whales and countless other animals engage in cooperative hunting and other activities. We are also all familiar with stories of animals helping each other and helping humans, even in the circumstances of great cost to themselves. Less familiar is the research on reciprocity and fairness. Beckhoff and Pierce summarize some of the primate research conducted by Sarah Brosnan and Franz de Waal. Quote, Capuchin monkeys are a highly social and cooperative species in which food sharing is common. The monkeys carefully monitor equity and fair treatment amongst peers. Brosnan first trained a group of capuchin monkeys to use small pieces of rock as tokens of exchange for food. Pairs of females were then asked to barter for treats. One monkey was asked to swap a piece of granite for a grape. A second monkey, who had just witnessed the rock for grape trade, was asked to swap a rock for a piece of cucumber, a much less desirable treat. The short-changed monkey would refuse to cooperate with the researchers and wouldn't eat the cucumber and would often throw it back at the human. In a nutshell, the Capuchins expected to be treated fairly. They seemed to measure and compare rewards in relation to those around them. The single monkey who traded a rock for a cucumber would be delighted with the outcome. It was only when others seemed to get something better that the cucumber suddenly became undesirable. End quote. Reciprocal altruism and aversion to inequity, the Capuchins' reaction to perceived unfair treatment, indicate that social animals pay close attention to the fair sharing of social goods. But it is not just food sharing that is governed by the norms of reciprocity. Social animals adhere to norms governing many aspects of their lives, such as mating, playing, and grooming. We tend to dismiss a lot of this behavior as blind instinct, a drive to dominate or to reproduce, when in fact it reflects a process of conscious learning, negotiating, and developing social norms. This is well illustrated by Beckhoff's fascinating observations of play behavior amongst wolves, coyotes, and dogs. Play is related to morality because both involve systems of rules and expectations and sanctions for violations. Through play, community members are introduced to social norms of reciprocity and fairness. Social play, quote, rests on foundations of fairness, cooperation, and trust, and it can break down when individuals cheat. During social play, individuals can learn a sense of what's right or wrong, what's acceptable to others, the result of which is development and maintenance of a social group, a game, that operates efficiently. This fairness and other forms of cooperation provide a foundation for social play. Animals have to continually negotiate agreements about their intentions to play so that cooperation and trust prevail, and they learn to take turns and set up handicaps to make play fair. They also learn to forgive. End quote. Canids invite one another to play by bowing, indicate that play is underway with its special set of rules. For example, you have to control your power and the strength of your bite so that others aren't hurt. You have to recognize that during play, it is okay to transgress rules that apply outside of the play context. For example, a subordinate animal challenging a dominant one, or a dominant animal submitting to a subordinate. In other words, play levels the playing field, as it were. Self-handicapping of power and status ensures that behaviors that would be threatening in other contexts, biting, mounting, or tackling, are understood to be play. Violations of play are not tolerated, as when a dog becomes too aggressive, or attempts to translate play mounting into an actual sexual act. When a violation occurs, play is potentially disrupted, so animals constantly negotiate and reassure each other that they are still playing. Beckhoff has observed that the bow is used widely in canid play, not just to initiate play, but to negotiate it on an ongoing basis. If a dog hits or bites a little too hard, and his partner reacts with confusion, the violator will bow by way of apology and reassurance. Sorry, my bad. Let's keep playing. If he's to make an apparently aggressive move, he will first bow to indicate, don't worry, this is just play. Canids who violate the rules of fair play are excluded from play, and sometimes expelled from the social group altogether. This digression into the fascinating world of canid play shows that dogs have the capacity for understanding and negotiating social rules, and for observing and responding to the expectations of others in the social group. But what does this tell us about the potential for domesticated animal citizenship in mixed human-animal communities? Dogs may understand the rules of good citizenship amongst their own kind, but how does this translate to mixed society? The fact is that dogs display a very similar capacity for negotiating social rules of human-dog society. Indeed, one of the most striking differences between dogs and wild canids is that dogs are highly attuned to humans and look to them for social cues and guidance. Tamed wolves and coyotes don't do this. In other words, dogs' repertoire of skills for social cooperation, for example, learning and negotiating norms of acceptable and fair behavior and attending to the expectations of others, has evolved in a dog-human community. Dogs are remarkably adept at reading human behavior and negotiating terms of cooperation. A wonderful story by Alger and Alger explores friendship between dogs and cats living in the same households. Dog and cat friends often sit or sleep curled up together and greet and touch each other regularly. They like going for walks together and will protect one another from outside threats. Most of all, they enjoy playing together. Dogs and cats have specific forms of play which they engage in with their conspecifics. To cross the species divide, they must correctly communicate and interpret play overtures and behaviors. For example, cats quickly learn to understand a dog's bow as an invitation to play, even though cats don't bow themselves. Similarly, dogs correctly interpret that cats are inviting play when they do a quick run past, or lie on the ground with all four legs extended. Cohabiting cats and dogs don't understand all of each other's behavior, but they negotiate a repertoire for communicating with one another. Moreover, this repertoire is not restricted to tight scripts used in their own species play. For example, Alger and Alger found that cats successfully adapted cat greeting and affection behaviors, such as headbutting or tail curling, as invitations to play with dogs, even though they would not use the same behaviors to engage other cats in play. It is not just dogs and cats who recognize that they are part of a cooperative community with humans and each other. Most domesticated animals know to seek out humans for help, for either themselves or for others. Young describes several instances in which cows, anticipating a difficult birth or concerned for the welfare of another cow, sought human assistance. Mason describes the case of Lulu the pig, who saved her human companion, Joanne Altsman. Altsman was in the kitchen one day and feeling very unwell. Lulu sensed that something was wrong. She forced her body through the dog door, scraping herself and drawing blood in the process. She ran out to the road and lay across it until a car stopped, and then led the driver back to the kitchen where Altsman had suffered a heart attack. Most animals recognize when vets are trying to help them, even if the process, for example setting a limb, receiving an injection, undergoing porcupine quill extraction, is uncomfortable. In other words, they understand that they form part of a cooperative society with humans. We can see this in some of the dog stories we related earlier. It is evident that under the conditions of mutual respect, animals can recognize that cooperative society is negotiated on an ongoing basis. Julius knew that his walks with Christine were his special time of the day, and that it was his prerogative to negotiate how this time was spent. Elizabeth Marshall Thomas describes how her dogs respond most of the time when she calls them because she doesn't make unreasonable demands. They ignore her requests only when they have reasonable grounds for doing so. Barbara Smots gives a wonderful account of this kind of negotiation with her dog Safi over contentious areas such as how to interact with squirrels, cats, and other animals sharing their environment. The negotiation of social life goes in both directions. Safi has also trained Smuts in various ways: not to step over her when she is asleep, not to clean mud off her stomach except with a very soft cloth. As for the much-hated bath, quote, I bring her into the bathroom and suggest that she climb into the tub. Usually with great reluctance she does so, but sometimes she chooses not to, in which case she voluntarily travels to the kitchen where she remains until the mud has dried enough for me to brush it off. Similarly, when playing fetch with a toy, Safi drops it when I ask her to, only about half the time. If she refuses to drop it, it means either that she is inviting a game of keep away, or that she wants to rest with her toy for a while before chasing it some more. Since the toys belong to her, and since she never substitutes objects like my new shoes, it seems fair that she decides when to keep the toy and when to share it with me. All of these cases challenge our conventional notions about humans issuing directives and dogs obeying them. These dogs are clearly inclined to cooperate and please their human companions, but they are also quite prepared to assert their own preferences or to renegotiate terms of cooperation. In short, to exercise a form of citizenship involving both rights and responsibilities. We can look at these stories and say, oh well, these are obviously very special and unique animals. Maybe so. But a more appropriate response might be to say, oh well, these are very obviously special and unique humans. That is, humans who recognize dogs as beings who have individual preferences, who are capable of communicating these, and of negotiating the terms of coexistence with their human companions. It's not simply that these animals have special innate capacities, though that is no doubt part of the equation, but that their human companions are prepared to enable the development of these capacities. How many animals are capable of this kind of self-regulation and negotiation of cooperative life? We can't answer that question, since we've only just begun to ask it. There is enormous uncharted territory here once we recognize domesticated animals as our fellow citizens rather than chattels, slaves, or alien intruders. One of the most important unknowns is whether domesticated animals will continue to choose to be a part of mixed society with humans, once given greater freedom and assisted agency. When Elizabeth Marshall Thomas moved to the country and created a very large enclosed area in which her dogs were free to establish their lives of their choosing, the result was that while they were certainly never cut off contact with her and continued to rely on her for food and emergency assistance, they did withdraw somewhat, gradually reorienting their lives around each other rather than human companions. In The Dogs Who Came to Stay, George Pitcher describes a story with an opposite trajectory, of Luna the stray dog who gradually came to trust and adopt Pitcher as his partner. Rita Mae Brown describes how her 11-year-old dog Godzilla adopted the next-door neighbor as her primary human, although she returned almost daily to visit Brown on her farm. And Thomas describes a similar experience with her free-roaming cat Pula, who had opted to live with a family up the road, although she still greets Thomas eagerly when their paths cross. In both of these latter instances, Godzilla and Pula left multi-animal houses for homes in which they were the only animal companion and the sole focus of human attention. Animal sanctuaries provide some insight into the possible future with domesticated animals. The donkeys at Dancing Star Sanctuary in California inhabit a world that lies somewhere between traditional farm life and life in the wild. The donkeys are free to interact with humans on their own terms and often choose to do so, especially with the people they like. They are dependent on humans for certain supports, supplementation of a free-roaming diet, security, and veterinary care. At the same time, they're integrated into a larger ecosystem. Deer, turkeys, bobcats, mountain lions, and countless smaller birds and creatures also inhabit the sanctuary. Young's description of the cows at Kite's Nest Farm indicates that they too are not cut off from the surrounding ecosystem, but are integrated into it. Young's free-roaming cows encounter deer, badgers, foxes, wildcats, and many other creatures in their rambles. They have a foot in both worlds, a shared society with humans, and a role in the larger ecological system extending beyond human settlement. It's possible that some domesticated animals, given greater control over their lives, would choose to completely opt out of shared human society. Masson argues that this might be the case with horses, who seem to have the physiological and psychological traits to readily withdraw from humans and successfully rewild, but it is much less likely with dogs, who are strongly bonded with humans. In short, the scope of agency for domesticated animals is unknown. The more we learn about animal capacities, the more potential we see. Moreover, the nature of dependent agency is that it is created through relationship, not deducible from the innate capacities of individuals. As Smuts says, subjectivity/personhood is not a capacity we either discover or fail to find in another, but rather a way of being in relation with others. So we must keep an open mind about the potential scope of animal agency, recognizing that it will always be highly variable and dependent on individual, contextual, and structural factors. Recognizing domesticated animals as citizens means we have a duty to foster their agency, always aware that these capacities vary across individuals and over time, and that they can be blunted or enhanced by our actions, often in unintended or unpredictable ways. All of this is true, we should remember, for human citizens as well as animal ones. Section 4. Towards a theory of domestic animal citizenship. To recap the discussion so far, we have argued A, that justice for domesticated animals requires accepting that they are members of our society, to be included in our social and political arrangements on fair terms, and B, that citizenship is the appropriate framework for conceptualizing membership, given that domesticated animals have the requisite capacities to be citizens, capacities to have and express a subjective good, to participate, and to cooperate. But what would this look like in practice? What would it mean to conceive domesticated animals through the lens of membership and citizenship? What forms of use of or interaction with domesticated animal citizens would be permitted, under what conditions? There is a natural tendency to want to answer this question by formulating a fixed list of citizenship rights and responsibilities. In our view, this is premature, since such a list can only be the outcome of a process of enabling agency and participation amongst all co-citizens. If domesticated animals were merely passive wards, we could formulate our humanitarian duties to them in advance of their own input or participation. But if animals are co-citizens with the right to shape collective social and political arrangements, then we need to know more about how they are likely to express their subjective good, and how they are likely to comply with or contest social norms. This will be an ongoing process with unpredictable outcomes. However, we can at least think about what is entailed or presupposed by ideas of membership/citizenship, and conversely, what is inconsistent with them. We will try to identify the presuppositions of citizenship in 9 areas. 1. Basic socialization. 2. Mobility and the sharing of public space. 3. Duties of protection. 4. Use of animal products. 5. Use of animal labor. 6. Medical care. 7. Sex and reproduction. 8. Predation/diet. 9. Political representation. This is not an exhaustive list, but it does cover many of the most pressing moral issues regarding the relations between humans and domesticated animals. In each case, our aim is not to provide a conclusive resolution of the challenges involved, but rather to show how a citizenship framework provides a distinctive lens for thinking about our obligations, one that goes beyond traditional animal rights theory, and one that is more compelling than the various abolitionist, threshold, and species norm views we discussed in Chapter 4. Basic socialization. Membership in any community involves a process of socialization, and so any theory of citizenship has to say something about how the individuals are socialized into membership. Existing members must pass on the basic skills and knowledge that children or newcomers will need to fit in or flourish. In the human case, failure to socialize a child is a form of abuse, like failing to feed, protect, or nurture. This is true of domesticated animals as well. Animals, like human infants, arrive in the world ready to learn, ready to explore, ready to figure out the rules, ready to find their place. If we fail to challenge this readiness appropriately, we harm them. Socialization, in this sense, is a right of membership. Failure to socialize domesticated animals blights their chances of flourishing in human-animal society. We should note here that basic socialization is different from training for particular forms of labor, such as training dogs to be guide dogs for the blind. Socialization involves the basic and general skills/knowledge that individuals need to learn, insofar as possible, in order to be accepted into social community, like establishing control over bodily processes and impulses, learning basic communication, rules of social interaction, and respect for others. Training, on the other hand, is about the development of a particular individual's capacities and interests. Socialization is a basic threshold precondition for social membership. We return to the question of training for domesticated animals later in this chapter. We all have a basic right to be socialized into a community. But into which community? Here is where our citizenship model differs clearly from other accounts. How we define the boundaries and membership of the political community will shape our understanding of what constitutes appropriate socialization for any particular individual. For example, if we think of cat community as defined strictly by species, then we will think of cat socialization in terms of learning the basic norms and knowledge of cat society, a process guided by adult cats. But if we think of cats as members of a mixed human-animal community, then the right of basic socialization encompasses the norms and knowledge needed for cats to flourish in that mixed society, not just in cat society. However, the same goes for human members of mixed society. At the moment, learning how to live with the animals in our midst is part of socialization for some humans, within certain families or subcultures, but certainly not all. However, if we recognize domesticated animals as members of a joint political community, then a certain level of basic socialization in both directions becomes mandatory. Part of recognizing and respecting each other as co-citizens. Just as socialization for citizenship involves learning how to respect and cooperate and participate with people of different races and religions, so too should it involve learning about the sorts of cooperative relations with domesticated animals that we discussed earlier. However, the content of what constitutes appropriate socialization is an open question. It can vary widely according to the circumstances. A horse born into a free-roaming horse sanctuary who will have limited contact with humans doesn't need much socialization into mixed human society, since his agency will be exercised primarily amongst other horses, and they will look after his basic socialization needs, including the basics of getting along with other animals, like rattlers or mountain lions who might share the same geographic territory. A dog adopted into a human family, on the other hand, needs to learn quite a bit more about getting along in mixed human-animal society. The community in which she will flourish, and in which she must learn to respect some basic rights of others, is a community that includes not just other dogs and humans, but possibly cats, squirrels, birds, and others. She needs to be housebroken, to learn not to bite or to jump up on people, to be wary of cars, and to not chase the family cat, unless it's a play chase, for example. She will learn not just from other dogs, but also from humans, and possibly the cat too. In other words, even if we conceive all domesticated animals as members of a mixed human-animal political community, requiring some degree of mutual socialization, the actual content of appropriate socialization will vary greatly according to circumstances. Nevertheless, while the content of socialization is adaptable to individual and contextual factors, there are some general principles that should guide the process. The first, as noted, is that socialization should be conceived not as the right of parents or states to mold individuals, but as the responsibility of parents or states to recognize individuals as members of the community and to give them skills and knowledge they need to thrive in that community insofar as possible. Second, socialization is not a lifelong process of control and intervention, but a temporary developmental process for bringing individuals into full membership into the community. It is justified not as an end in itself, but because it facilitates the emergence of agency and the capacity to participate. By a certain point, individuals have either internalized the basic norms or they have not. Either way, the duty of others to mold them ends with childhood. At a certain point, respect requires that we accept that people are who they are, full citizens, warts and all. After that, individuals who violate basic norms may be humorously tolerated, shunned, or if they become a danger to others, locked up. But it would be disrespectful to continue to treat them like children. There are exceptions to this general picture, of course, as when childhood trauma, abuse, and neglect has severely delayed or limited socialization. But in general, we are molded when we are young, and then respected as autonomous agents when we achieve adulthood. Recognizing domesticated animals as citizens implies that a similar approach is appropriate, that is, that we attend to basic socialization when they are young, but do not see them as subject to lifelong molding. Acceptable paternalism allows for a limited period in which adults socialize the young, but it would be pernicious paternalism, indeed domination, to turn this into a lifelong relationship of molder-molded. And yet many people seem to view domesticated animals as permanent children in this sense, subjecting them to continuous efforts at molding well past the age when they achieve adulthood. People with SID are also frequently subject to this kind of pernicious paternalism. In addition to limiting the duration of socialization, we also, in the human context, recognize strict limitations on how it is undertaken. There has been a great variation in socialization methods over time and across cultures. In liberal democracies, a clear trend has emerged away from coercive and authoritarian methods towards a positive reinforcement and gentle correction model of how the process should work. Harsh punishment and threats are generally viewed as unnecessary and unproductive, not to mention abusive. For the most part, wild animals also socialize their members without much violence or coercion. As is clear from Beckhoff's discussion of wild canids, play is a key component of the socializing process, guiding the young towards knowledge of social norms in a non-threatening context. Many social animals, like humans, are generally amenable to socialization through methods of positive reinforcement and gentle correction. We all come into the world eager and primed to learn how to fit in, a situation which calls for wise guidance, not threat or force. The fact that socialization of domesticated animals by humans is so often harsh and coercive is a comment not on the capacities of animals, but in the ignorance, impatience, and disrespect of humans. Freedom of movement and the sharing of public space. To accept domesticated animals as members of our community means accepting that they belong here in the community and have prima facie right to share its public spaces. Acknowledging membership is inconsistent with confining individuals to private seclusion or to designated segregation zones. Yet that is precisely how contemporary societies typically treat domesticated animals. We greatly restrict the free movement of domesticated animals, both by the use of physical restraint, crates and cages, fenced runs, chains, leashes, etc., and by the use of mobility restrictions on access to public spaces, businesses, beaches, parks, public transportation, or even city limits in the case of agricultural animals. In fact, we devote a remarkable amount of time and energy to controlling domesticated animals, to keeping them in their place. This extreme containment helps maintain their invisibility, allowing us to delude ourselves about the ubiquity and significance of their presence in our lives. This enormous exercise of confinement constitutes a serious violation of domesticated animals' basic rights, and indeed violates even minimal standards of protection against cruelty. But what sorts of regulations on freedom of movement and access are permissible within a citizenship model? How do we distinguish acceptable from unacceptable restrictions? We consider first the case of the negative right against being restrained or confined. We then consider the more positive right to mobility. In the human context, we consider the right against confinement/restraint as a fundamental right, to be suspended only under conditions that meet a very demanding test of need and proportionality. For example, we might restrain individuals who pose a serious threat to themselves or others, either intentionally, in the case of violent aggressors or suicidal individuals, or unintentionally, in the case of someone infected with a life-threatening contagion or high on drugs/alcohol and about to engage in high-risk behavior. Most of these restraints are justified on a temporary basis only, until an immediate risk has been removed. But we also impose physical confinement in more enduring ways as a form of justified paternalism. We use forms of restraint and confinement with infants and children for several years until they can safely negotiate their environment. Such restrictions call for clear justification, however. Historically, people with disabilities or mental illness have been confined in ways that far exceed unacceptable paternalism. This should make us wary of calls for confinement/restraint that are alleged to be in the interests of the person being subject to restriction. The positive right to mobility is viewed in less absolute terms than the negative right against restraint. Our right to mobility is circumscribed in a number of ways, most notably by international borders and by private property laws. Both of these are modern developments, leading some commentators to equate modernity with growing restrictions on our mobility rights. However, mobility has always been circumscribed. In the modern world, this takes the form of geographical/political boundaries, whereas historically it tended to take the form of social position. For example, your movement was historically controlled by your status as a serf, soldier, member of nobility, or cleric. But free movement has always been constrained by socio-political, and not to mention practical, limitations. While some cosmopolitan theorists call for an unqualified right to mobility, most theorists recognize that mobility matters because, and insofar as, it is necessary to provide us with access to a reasonable range of options for leading a flourishing life. We have the right to adequate or sufficient mobility, not unlimited mobility. To be sure, restrictions on mobility can operate to perpetuate unjust inequalities within and between states. Under conditions of injustice, restrictions on mobility, such as the right of rich people to keep others off their property, or of rich countries to keep out people from poor countries, become a key mechanism for preserving privilege. However, the underlying problem here is inequality, not restrictions on mobility per se. If we imagine a world that has eliminated unfair inequalities between states, or between citizens within a given state, then restrictions on mobility are not inherently unjust. It's important to many people to be able to move and work freely within their country, and for many to travel and see other parts of the world. But it doesn't follow that we have the right to become citizens of any country of our choosing, or that all private property should be abolished, or that governments shouldn't be able to block off unsafe beaches and treacherous roads, or control access to fragile ecosystems and cultural sites. In other words, we need enough mobility to be able to lead our lives, make a living, socialize, learn, grow, and have fun. But assuming the scope of mobility is in place, we do not have the right to go anywhere we want or to move anywhere we want. Whereas physical restraint is always prima facie harmful, bounded mobility is not, so long as people have a sufficient range of good opportunities within those bounds. Mobility is also a key relative marker of social standing and inclusion. Oppressed groups invariably find their mobility rights restricted. Consider Nazi restrictions on Jews in the 1930s, the Bantustan system in South Africa, caste restrictions in India, Jim Crow in the USA, or travel restrictions imposed on women in Saudi Arabia. In other words, mobility is important not just because we need it to be able to carry out our lives as we see fit, but also because it functions as a way of distinguishing full citizens from subordinated groups, especially by restricting their access to public space. It's possible for a particular restriction to pass the sufficient options test, i.e., it doesn't impose an unreasonable restriction on someone's ability to live a flourishing life, while failing the social inclusion test. For example, even if the Jim Crow lunch counters for blacks were just as good as the ones for whites, separate but equal, they would have functioned as a mark of social exclusion and inequality. These forms of exclusion are designed to send a message that certain individuals or groups do not belong here with us, and that they need to be kept in their subordinate place. In addition to blatant and intentionally discriminatory restrictions on mobility, there are unintentional forms of mobility discrimination. Consider the case of people with physical disabilities for whom the structure of modern cities, designed with the able-bodied in mind, acts as a barrier to mobility and access. These oversights may be unintentional, but they highlight unexamined assumptions about who is considered a full citizen. Full citizenship is measured not just by being included in a list of legal rights holders, but by being considered when the institutions of a shared society are being conceived. Part of being recognized as a full citizen is that the very shape of public space and movement is designed with your input and your needs in mind. So, differential restrictions of mobility can function as direct forms of social exclusion, or as indirect markers of inequality. But not all forms of differential restriction are an assault on dignity or a marker of inequality. Often, mobility rights are connected to occupational roles. For example, security or maintenance workers, theatrical performers, scholars, and countless other occupational groups have access to public spaces to which other citizens do not, and this is not problematic. Such restrictions do not compromise anyone's access to sufficient options, nor do they function as a tool of social exclusion. Similarly, restricting children's access to strip clubs or adult cinemas is an acceptable form of paternalism which passes the sufficient options and social exclusion tests. And as discussed in relation to confinement/restraint, there are times when mobility rights of adults are limited on paternalistic grounds or by the need to protect others. We restrict people from driving if they cannot demonstrate competence. We restrict some people from air travel if they have a medical condition or are in a state of advanced pregnancy, which might put them at risk. We issue injunctions to prevent individuals from approaching near to others whom they have threatened in the past. In yet other cases, we allow people to move freely on the condition that they wear a monitoring device, for example, certain parolees, or submit to chemical castration, for example, as an alternative to incarceration for a repeated sex offender. Our purpose here isn't to defend any particular catalog of mobility rights or restrictions in a liberal society, but rather to draw in broad strokes a general picture about how we think about the right of free movement. To summarize, in the human case, we can see three basic principles. 1. A very strong presumption against any form of restraint or confinement, except in cases where individuals pose a demonstrable threat to themselves or to the basic liberties of others. 2. A positive right to sufficient mobility, providing access to an adequate range of options needed for a flourishing life. 3. Opposition to restrictions on mobility, even if they leave individuals with sufficient options, if A. They are adopted in order to express second-class subordinate citizenship, for example, Jim Crow-style segregation, or B. They have emerged inadvertently because certain groups were simply not considered when designing access to certain spaces and places, for example, access for people with disabilities. Such restrictions are inconsistent with acknowledging the full membership of all individuals in the community. In our view, The same basic principles can and should apply when thinking about the mobility rights of domesticated animals, although their detailed application will naturally differ. The first principle arguably does not depend on recognizing domesticated animals as co-citizens. It could be endorsed from within a wardship model, or indeed any approach that prohibits harm to sentient beings. But the second and third principles, we believe, are tied to the recognition of domesticated animals as co-citizens. They reflect positive obligations we have in virtue of having brought domesticated animals into our community, thereby acquiring the responsibility to reshape our collective society to accommodate those animals fairly. Our current treatment of domesticated animals violates all of these principles. Indeed, it violates the strong prima facie presumption against confinement and restraint. Indeed, far from being presumptively illegitimate, there seems to be a general presumption that such restrictions are necessary and justifiable as a matter of human convenience. We restrain/confine domesticated animals with muzzles, leashes, chains, cages, and pens. We also violate the requirement to provide sufficient positive mobility, and we do so in ways that are both intentionally discriminatory — animals don't belong here, they need to be kept in their subordinate place — and unintentional — we just didn't consider their interests when designing access to public spaces. All of this is done as a matter of course, with no sense that such extraordinary restrictions call for extraordinary justification. We have general proscriptions. For example, all dogs must be leashed, no pets allowed, no chickens within city limits, restricting the free movement of animals without any consideration of the capacity of individual animals to safely negotiate a range of human-animal environments without restraint, or the impact of these restrictions on either the flourishing of animals or as their standing as members of a shared community. This approach would no longer be acceptable if we recognize domesticated animals as co-citizens. This is not to say that restrictions cannot be justified. As in the case of humans, animals need sufficient mobility, not unlimited mobility. This need may be adequately met with large fenced ranges and pastures and parks. And mobility restrictions are also justifiable on the grounds of protecting domesticated animals from predators, from highways, or from other dangers, and on the basis of protecting people from animals. Some forms of confinement and restraint can be justified as paternalistic developmental measures. For example, to socialize a dog so that he will be able in time to exercise responsible adult agency. They can be justified for adult dogs who have not yet learned to be street smart, or to resist chasing squirrels, or jumping up on people. In other words, dogs vary greatly in terms of their ability to negotiate the reciprocal boundaries of social life. Some will need more restraint than others, either to protect them or to protect others. The point is that as citizens, animals would be presumed to have the skills for negotiating a social life, a right to be taught these skills, and an opportunity to appeal arbitrary restrictions on their freedom of movement. No doubt there would still be many justifiable restrictions on animals' movement, but these would always have a provisional status, open to appeal, negotiation, and ongoing evolution. We simply don't know what human-animal society might eventually look like under these conditions. It may be difficult to fulfill this sufficient mobility principle for some domesticated animals. Consider goldfish, or the recently domesticated budgerigars. On one hand, domesticated budgies and goldfish have lost some of their fitness for survival in the wild, so we cannot simply turn them loose. On the other hand, providing them with tanks or aviaries that meet the test of sufficient mobility is a large undertaking. In such cases, the commitments of a citizenship approach may not be achievable. Where there is no prospect for rewilding, but nor can we provide the mobility conditions needed for a flourishing domesticated existence, a citizenship model may fail, and we may well be pushed towards the abolitionist/extinctionist position. But there is no reason to assume that this is true of most or all domesticated animals. A citizenship approach would not only challenge the acceptability of restrictions on the free movement of animals, but it would also require us to learn how to enhance accessibility and reduce barriers to mobility. We need to ask, how can we alter our infrastructure, habits, and expectations in order to help domesticated animals act as responsible co-citizens, i.e., citizens who can follow the basic rules of social community and not endanger themselves or others, and to ensure that we aren't imposing arbitrary or unnecessary barriers to their mobility. Recall Catherine MacKinnon's famous dictum about the structure of American society being an affirmative action program for men. It's fascinating to start thinking about how human societies are an affirmative action program for those who walk on 2 legs instead of 4, or use a wheelchair or a walker, whose sight lines are above 5 feet, who rely primarily on visual signs instead of auditory or olfactory, or human language rather than symbols or sign language, and so on. When you start thinking this way, the issues don't always line up with humans on one side and animals on the other. Dogs, cats, and children, due to their height, are all vulnerable to being run over by cars backing up. People in wheelchairs find stairs a great impediment, as some animals do. Foreign visitors are often mystified by linguistic information, as most animals are. And as is the case for people with disabilities, animals can have compensatory abilities. In the case of animals, these include a more acute sense of smell, attention to body language, physical speed and agility, and so on. Animals are better able to negotiate many contexts than humans, for example, threading through crowds or streams of traffic, jumping obstacles, maintaining balance on precarious footing, locating food sources. In other words, integrating domesticated animals into the polis involves rethinking our shared spaces on multiple levels, not just removing barriers to mobility, but thinking about what special abilities animals bring into the mix. Similarly, we need to think about whether and how restrictions on mobility and access can function as markers of inferiority. Consider North American bans on animal companions accompanying humans into restaurants. This is typically justified on the grounds of food safety. However, as we discussed earlier, the absence of such bans in countries like France has not resulted in outbreaks of disease. In fact, what seems to be at stake here are the certain ideas about where animals belong, or disgust reactions to seeing animals in proximity to food. In other words, such blanket bans are more closely akin to blacks to the back of the bus, or no Jews allowed, than they are to employees must wash hands after using the restroom, or all passengers must wipe their feet on the antibacterial mat. Such restrictions, in addition to violating the principles of demonstrated need and proportionality discussed earlier, function as social markers of hierarchy. They simultaneously bar certain groups from full citizenship, and at the same time help to render invisible those who have been barred. In effect, we are back to the Victorian household in which servants are restricted to the back stair, second class and invisible. To summarize, recognizing animals as citizens has 3 key implications for mobility rights. First, it means extending to domesticated animals the same general presumption against restraint/confinement and the positive right to sufficient mobility for leading a flourishing life. Second, citizenship theory encourages us to attend to questions of structural inequality, that is society constructed in ways that limit unnecessarily the mobility of certain individuals or groups? And finally, it asks us to attend to questions of recognition and respect, that is, are there ways in which society uses arbitrary restrictions on mobility as a way of marking inferior status? Duties of protection. Recognizing domesticated animals as co-citizens has implications for our duties to protect them from harm, including harm from human beings, harm from other animals, and more generally harm from accidents or natural disasters. We will say a few words about each of these cases. As with the issue of mobility, some of these duties do not depend on the status of domesticated animals as citizens, but simply on their status as beings with a subjective good whose basic rights should be respected. Others, however, are tied specifically to the fact of membership. Citizens are entitled to the full benefit and protection of the law, and this means that the duty of humans not to harm animals is not simply a moral or ethical responsibility, but ought to be a legal one. Harms to animals, like harms to humans, should be criminalized. This would include both the criminalization of deliberate harm and also of negligence leading to harm or death. But as we know, there is often a world of difference between the law on the books and what is actually enforced. Laws against wife assault were for many years simply ignored and rarely investigated or prosecuted. The same is true today about many existing laws against animal cruelty. Indeed, one measure of the extent to which individuals are truly acknowledged as co-citizens is precisely whether they actually receive the effective protection of the law. As a society, when it comes to serious crimes against human beings, we invest enormous resources to prevent these crimes in the first place, or when they occur, to find the perpetrators and subject them to criminal proceedings and pay for their incarceration and treatment if necessary. Our extensive criminal justice system serves several functions: protecting the vulnerable, deterring crime, enacting deserved retribution in proportion to the blameworthiness of the guilty party, and restoring communities to wholeness after a violation. But perhaps its greatest function is simply to show how seriously we, as a society, take the protection of basic rights by backing up our commitment with enforcement mechanisms. We all grow up under the umbrella of these mechanisms, learning from the earliest age that respect for basic rights of others is a vital glue of social life. Most of us internalize these injunctions and have no desire to contravene them. Recognizing that domesticated animals are co-citizens would entail viewing that they too are owed full protection under the law, and that the criminal law should be used to reflect and uphold their membership in the community. Does this principle entail that people who intentionally kill a dog or cat should be subject to the same sorts of penalties as the murderers of humans? In a recent article about a chimpanzee who was shot after escaping confinement in the UK, Cavalieri asked why his killers were not tracked down and prosecuted, and looked forward to, quote, a time when this killing will be seen for what it is, murder, end quote. We, too, look forward to such a time. But the relationship between criminalization and punishment is complex. Punishment serves a variety of functions: to deter future transgressions, to send a symbolic message of society's abhorrence of a particular action, to enact deserved retribution in proportion to the blameworthiness of the guilty party, and to enable the victim or his or her family to feel closure. These different functions often pull in different directions in the human case, and are likely to do so in the animal case as well. For example, the blameworthiness of an individual's transgression is often understood in terms of the extent to which she has deliberately and flagrantly violated well-established social norms that she was socialized to uphold. Where those social norms are not yet well established, or where individuals have not been socialized to uphold those norms, the guilty party is likely to be less deserving of punishment. However, it may be precisely in those circumstances that the deterrence function calls for stronger punishment, so as to establish more firmly these new social norms of respect for animal life. This suggests that sentencing guidelines are likely to change over time in light of evolving social norms and patterns of socialization. As we discuss in chapters 6 and 7, the deliberate killing of non-citizen animals, whether animals in the wild or liminal animals in urban space, should also be criminalized, just as prohibitions on murder and harm apply equally to human visitors and aliens, not just to citizens. But other duties of protection may apply only to co-citizen domesticated animals rather than to all animals. For example, domesticated animal citizens need protection not only from humans, but also from other animals. We need to take steps to protect them from predators, disease, accidents, floods, or fires. In these cases, it is their status as members of our society, not just their intrinsic moral status as sentient beings, that calls forth our duties of protection and rescue. As we write this chapter, two interesting controversies have emerged that illustrate our theme. The first concerned news footage of the Los Angeles Fire Department rescuing a dog during a flood, one in a long series of similar controversies concerning the rescuing of domesticated animals in cases of disaster, such as the Katrina hurricane. Some defenders of these efforts responded that rescuing animals provides good training for the rescuing of humans. In our view, the moral injunction is much similar. Having brought such animals into our society, we take upon ourselves a duty to protect them. As we see in chapter 6, we do not have a comparable duty to, say, protect squirrels in the wild from floods or forest fires, or to protect them from their natural predators. The second example concerned how to deal with a coyote that had moved into a neighborhood of Toronto from the surrounding woods, and was believed to be killing local dogs and cats. Similar scenarios are occurring throughout coyotes' expanding North American range. In our view, there is a duty to protect domesticated animals from this sort of predation. In Chapter 7, we discuss a variety of measures for doing so without violating the rights of urban coyotes. Again, this is a duty owed to co-members. We have no comparable duty to protect, say, voles in the wild from the coyote, and no right to interfere with the predatory activities of coyotes living in the wild. Use of animal products. As we discussed in Chapter 4, several animal rights theory authors have attempted to distinguish between the legitimate use of animals and their illegitimate exploitation. As these authors rightly note, in the human case, we often use others in a variety of ways to satisfy our needs and desires, and this is not necessarily morally problematic. Many economic and other forms of exchange in human society provide examples of benign use, including exchanges of human body products such as hair and blood. The question is, when do such uses tip into exploitation? We argued that this distinction, while sound, can only be drawn in light of an underlying theory of membership. What counts as exploitation of immigrants, for example, cannot be answered by simply asking whether they are better off than they would have been in their country of origin. For refugees fleeing famine or civil war, virtually any form of existence, even slavery, might be an improvement. And what counts as exploitation of children cannot be answered simply by asking whether they are better off than they would have been if they had not been born at all. Again, even the most slavish life for children might be better than not being born at all. Rather, we need to ask what forms of use are consistent with full membership in society, and what forms of use condemn people to the status of permanently subordinated caste or class. In the human case, we have a number of guidelines and safeguards to mark this distinction. For example, children or immigrants may be temporarily denied their rights to full citizenship, while they mature or integrate into a new society, but not permanently so. At a certain point, all citizens must have the freedom to make choices about their lives, where they work, live, and socialize, determining for themselves how they will be used by others. In other words, a chief protection against exploitation is that individuals have options and the freedom to exit exploitative situations. We may bring children and immigrants into the country with the expectation of benefiting from them, but once they enter the community, they are full rights-bearing members. We can benefit from their work, but we cannot unilaterally impose a life plan on them or restrict their access to the full benefits of citizenship. So too we believe with domesticated animals. Using others is legitimate if the terms of the relationship reflect and uphold the membership status of both parties, rather than the permanently subordinating one to the other, and this in turn requires, as far as possible, respecting their agency and choices. Because domesticated animals are significantly dependent on humans throughout their lives, they are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. It is very difficult for animals to exercise a right of exit, or to put up effective resistance to exploitative conditions. The tendency to ignore animal agency, for humans to call the shots, in Zamir's words, is overwhelming. Given that humans have a great stake in using animals, there is an omnipresent danger that they will adopt a self-serving picture of animals' needs and preferences, and this is why we have emphasized the need to recognize and enable animal agency. We have a responsibility to try and understand what animals are able to communicate to us about their needs and preferences, and to facilitate their realization of their own life projects. This does not mean that we cannot use animals or benefit from them, but it does mean that we can only do so under conditions that are consistent with their agency and their membership status. Let us first consider some uses that fall into the benign category. Many people derive enormous pleasure from watching dogs run freely and playing at the dog park. There is a sense in which we are using dogs for our pleasure, but our use in no way impedes or harms them. Nor does it impose a totalizing instrumental conception on them. That is, the fact that we derive pleasure from them does not mean that dogs only exist to give humans pleasure. Humans may bring dogs into their lives for pleasure and company, love, and inspiration, but this is compatible with dogs existing in and for themselves, as it is in the case of humans. Now let us consider a more obvious example of use. Imagine the town of Sheepville, in which a flock of sheep are full citizens of the community they share with humans. Their basic rights are protected, they enjoy the full benefits of citizenship, They roam freely in various large pastures with lots of shelter and a variety of food sources, under the watchful eye of humans who protect them from predators, tend to their medical needs, and supplement their diet appropriately. Humans benefit from the company of sheep, but they also benefit in other ways. At certain times of year, the sheep roam public parks and they keep the grass short. Or, as on the Danish island of Samso, they graze around the fields of solar panels, keeping the grass from growing up and obscuring the panels. Or, as in many parts of Europe, their grazing simply helps to maintain open pastoral areas, which support a diversity of other flora and fauna. In addition to this grazing activity, humans benefit from collecting sheep droppings and use it to fertilize their flower and vegetable gardens. These uses may seem to be utterly benign. The sheep are just doing what sheep do, and humans are benefiting from this uncoerced activity. Now let us consider a trickier example. Should humans in Sheepville use wool from sheep? Commercial wool operations harm sheep in many ways, subjecting animals to painful and frightening procedures in order to make wool gathering a profitable business, quite apart from the fact that the sheep eventually go to slaughter. But one can imagine ethical conditions under which humans can benefit from the use of sheep wool. Whereas wild sheep naturally shed their coats, domesticated sheep have been selectively bred to increase wool production, and many breeds have lost the ability to shed their coats. They need their wool to be shorn by humans once a year to protect them from disease and overheating. At Farm Sanctuary in Upper New York State, the sheep are shorn annually because it is in their interest that shearing be performed. Indeed, it would be an abuse to fail to shear them. The sanctuary minimizes the discomfort and stress of shearing as much as possible. Their expert shearer is very careful to keep the animals calm, and they make sure they are not nicked by the shears. After shearing, the sheep are clearly relieved to be free of the weight of their coats. But then, what to do with the wool? Since Farm Sanctuary is philosophically opposed to any human use of animals, the wool is not used by humans, but spread in the woods for use as bedding by birds and other animals. In a world that views domesticated animals in overwhelmingly instrumental terms, this may be an appropriate gesture for unsettling widespread human attitudes about our right to use animals. However, if we are attempting to imagine a just human-animal society in Sheepville, then a refusal to allow humans to use the sheep's wool, which must be shorn away for their own benefit, begins to look perverse. It rests on a presumption either that A, any use is necessarily exploitative, or B, use will inevitably lead down a slippery slope to exploitation. Regard the first point, that use is necessarily exploitative. We have already challenged this conflation by reference to the human case. Use is not necessarily exploitative, and indeed a refusal to use others, effectively to prevent them from contributing to the general social good, can itself be a form of denying them full citizenship. Consider here how denial of certain occupations to human groups, for example, excluding Jews from professions or prohibiting Israeli Arabs from serving in the military, is a mark of second-class citizenship. Citizenship is a cooperative social project, one in which all are recognized as equals, all benefit from the goods of social life, and all, according to their ability and inclination, contribute to the general good. Turning one group into a permanently subordinated caste that labors for others is a denial of citizenship, but refusing to consider that group as potential contributors to a common good is also a way of denying citizenship. The mode of contribution will vary greatly. Some may contribute simply by participating in loving and trusting relationships. Others might contribute in more material ways. What is important is that all be enabled to contribute in a way suited to them. This is a vital component of dignity, not just the self-respect we derive from contributing. After all, not everyone has the mental capacities for feeling self-respect. But the respect in which we are held by others is by virtue of our contributions. Farm Sanctuary separates domesticated animals out as a special class of protected beings, rather than conceiving of them as co-citizens of a mixed human-animal polity. But the protection need not be antithetical to use. If Sheepville allowed the human use of wool, everyone's interests could still count equally, and everyone's rights could still be protected. Moreover, everyone would be viewed as contributing to the social good. Individuals would vary enormously in terms of their capacities, agency, and degrees of dependency and independence, but they would all be viewed as willing participants in the social project, not just as a special class excluded from the give and take of communal life. This still leaves the second worry, that there is a slippery slope from use to exploitation. But, as in all slippery slope concerns, we need to consider carefully the kinds of stoppers we have in place. The primary cause of slippery slope pressure is commercialization. When the profit motive is introduced, there is a strong pressure towards exploitation. For example, steps to minimize the discomfort to sheep in the shearing process tend to cost more money. If you want to increase profit, you might be tempted to minimize these steps. Obviously, similar pressures exist in human economic activity. Pressures to increase work hours, reduce pay, compromise workplace safety, and so on. In the human case, workers in a just society can resist the slippery slope through collective bargaining, political action, or the right of exit. Animals too can exercise forms of resistance. Moreover, it would be possible in Sheepville to ensure that similar protections are in place for sheep via trustees who bargain, agitate, and advocate on their behalf. If for some reason it were not possible to protect sheep from the exploitative pressures of the profit motive, then commercialization of wool and wool products could simply be banned. After the annual shearing, Sheepville could allow residents to use the wool as they see fit, but prohibit them from selling it, or products made from it. Or it could be a non-profit arrangement in which earnings are used entirely for the maintenance of the sheep. There is room here for reasonable disagreement about whether commercialization of wool products is antithetical to respecting the rights of sheep citizens. That is, whether in the context of a group of citizens who are distinctly vulnerable to exploitation, commercialization pressures are simply too dangerous for their interests. In the human context, we see similar concerns about vulnerable groups. Is it best to prohibit children from working for money or to carefully regulate this work? Or in the case of people with severe intellectual disabilities, should employment be prohibited, not for profit, or profit-oriented? Prohibition denies individuals an opportunity for reciprocal citizenship. The profit motive generates responsibility for enormous caution and oversight to protect vulnerable workers from exploitation. What about other animal products such as eggs and milk? As in the case of sheep, the dangers here rapidly escalate with commercialization. If chickens or cows are brought into the world in order to derive profit from their eggs or milk, this will almost certainly entail sacrificing their basic rights. Currently, the egg system involves not only the horrific containment and abuse of hens, but the killing of male chicks, and the killing of hens when their egg production levels off, all of which is needed to sustain profitability. Let us imagine chicken citizens whose rights are fully protected and who enjoy the same rights as other citizens to be supported in leading a flourishing life. Domesticated hens produce many eggs. They could be allowed to incubate some fertilized eggs and have the opportunity to raise young, and yet still have many surplus eggs. Indeed, it is possible to identify the sex of embryos in the egg and allow the hens to incubate females only, or primarily. Is it wrong for humans to use these surplus eggs, or to feed them to their cats, as discussed below? At Farm Sanctuary, consistent with their production on wool, human consumption of eggs is forbidden. Instead, they are fed back to the chickens. We would argue, analogously to the wool discussion, that human use of eggs is not inherently exploitative. Humans could have chicken companions on the farm or in large backyards, chickens with flourishing lives, allowed plenty of scope to do what chickens like to do, chickens who explore and play and form social bonds, and raise young under the watchful eye of the humans who protect them, shelter them, and care for their food and medical needs. Meanwhile, humans could consume some of the chicken's eggs. It's true that this relationship would be in part based on use, that is, many humans who would choose to have chicken companions would do so at least in part because they want some eggs. But this fact of use need not compromise the full protection of chickens' rights and community membership. As in the sheep case, the primary concerns would be to ensure that mechanisms are in place to fully monitor and enforce these rights and to regulate commercial pressures that might erode these rights. Using milk from cows is more problematic. Dairy cows have been bred to produce abundant milk, and this breeding has undermined their health and longevity. For example, excess milk production reduces calcium stores, leading to weaker bones. In addition, to make dairy production a commercially viable process, male cows are killed to produce veal, Cows are continuously impregnated to keep them producing milk, which wears them out and contributes to many diseases, and calves are separated from cows in order to maximize the percentage of milk that goes to humans. Can we imagine a non-exploitative environment for cows, that is, one which recognizes them as full citizens and contributes to their flourishing in ways similar to those we have described for sheep and chickens? This would represent an enormous practical and financial undertaking on the part of humans, given the size and needs of cows, with limited return in terms of milk. Assuming that cows would follow their own inclination in terms of mating, and would raise their calves, there might be some surplus milk, but probably not very much. Meanwhile, cows and calves, male and female, unless it would be possible to sex select in a non-invasive manner, require significant space and resources for their care. In other words, it's hard to imagine anyone having cow companions except for the pleasure of their company, or because they are prepared to go great lengths for a bit of dairy. This does not mean that there will be no cows, just not very many. There will always be people who want to have cow companions, or pig companions, but the reality is that since these animals are less useful under a non-exploitative condition, fewer of them will be brought into the human-animal community. On the other hand, cautious commercialization of cow's milk could lead to it becoming a luxury good, resulting in a limited but stable cow community. Use of animal labor. So far, we have focused on cases in which humans benefit from using animals engaged in what they do naturally: eating grass, growing wool, producing manure, eggs, and milk. A different form of use involves training animals to perform various kinds of work for humans, such as assistance and therapy training for dogs or police training for horses. There are some jobs that dogs and other animals can perform without significant training. For example, if we return to Sheepville, we can imagine that the community also includes some dogs or donkeys who help to protect the sheep. This protective behavior is a natural instinct, much nurtured by selective breeding of certain dog breeds, that does not require much training, and we can imagine a full and flourishing life for a dog or donkey which includes performing some guard duties. We would need safeguards in place to ensure dogs or donkeys were not exploited in Sheepville. For example, only dogs and donkeys who enjoy the work, and who enjoy the company of sheep and other working dogs and donkeys would be considered. These animals would need to have the option of other activities, staying in bed, hanging out with humans, or sticking to a pasture with their own species, etc., as a way of assessing their preference for guarding sheep. And in any case, the hours of work would need to be strictly limited so that the donkey or dog didn't feel that they were always on call. With these provisos in place, we can imagine that a life involving a limited number of hours of guard duty could be deeply satisfying, offering variety, the satisfactions of directed activity, and plenty of social contacts. There may be other kinds of dog work that fall into this category. For example, a gregarious dog might enjoy accompanying her human on social work visits to hospitals or homes for the aged. There may be kinds of work in which dogs or rats use their superior sniffing skills, without excessive training required, to assist humans in detecting tumors, or incipient seizures, or dangerous substances, or tracking lost individuals. We emphasize, however, that the possibilities for exploitation are very high, and that the use of animals for these purposes would need to be carefully regulated. For such use to be non-exploitative, the animals must be in a position to give a clear indication that they enjoy the activity, that they thrive on the stimulation and contact, and that the work is not the price they need to pay to receive the love, approval, treats, and care that are their due and need. Work must be balanced with lots of downtime in which dogs engage in other activities and socialize with their human and dog friends. In other words, dogs, and other working animals, should have the same opportunity human citizens have to control the conditions under which they contribute to society, and to follow their own inclinations in terms of how they live their lives and with whom they spend their time. One danger is that we will mold and manipulate these needs and preferences to our ends. This is a classic problem of adaptive preferences, long recognized within the field of human justice. One of the worst forms of injustice is manipulating or brainwashing the oppressed so that they come to accept their oppression as natural, normal, or deserved. This has been an issue in theorizing about justice for women, lower castes, and other groups that have been socialized to accept subordination. It is clearly an issue for animals as well. Earlier, we discussed the fact that all domesticated animals have a right to basic socialization so that they can mature into competent citizens. Moreover, we discussed the right of individuals to have their own special interests and abilities nurtured. But this is a delicate process. In the human case, we recognize the difference between nurturing individual potential and coercing, molding, or brainwashing individuals to fill prescribed roles. There are some very bright animals who thrive on learning, testing, and developing their abilities, accomplishing tasks, and engaging in cooperative goal-oriented activity. One can imagine a very bright and energetic dog, for example, who couldn't be happier than when engaged in agility training with her human companion. There may be a certain amount of restraint, correction, and manipulation necessary in this learning process, but dogs can benefit from a certain amount of stick-to-it pressure from their humans, just as a child might benefit from parents who gently pressure her to give the piano lessons a few more tries before giving up. The parents may recognize musical talent, for example, and know that in the long term their child could derive enormous satisfaction from learning to play the piano, even if in the short term she might not see it that way. We trust parents to get this balance right because the overall context is one in which we know they have the child's interests at heart. We quickly lose trust in parents if we suspect that their intent is strictly to create a young performer to satisfy their own whims to hear live music, or to profit financially from the child's piano playing, or to enjoy bragging rights in conversation with other parents. These may all come to pass, that is, parents may benefit from their child's piano playing, but the primary motivation for education should be the child's interests and development. Viewed in this light, much training of domesticated animals is exploitative. Most therapy and assistance animals are not trained to develop their own potential interests, but molded to serve human ends. The same goes for horse riding, animals in the entertainment industry, and most other kinds of animal work. Animals with specific tractable temperaments are identified early and pegged for future roles. Training, often very intensive over many months, involves significant restraint and confinement, and frequently severe correction and deprivation. Even so-called positive reinforcement is usually thinly disguised coercion. If the only way a dog gets treats, playtime, or affection from others is by performing tasks to please them, then this is blackmail, not education. Many working animals are denied any real downtime in which they run free, socialize with others, or simply explore and experience their world. Their work often puts them in stressful and even dangerous situations. They are often denied a stable environment and continuity in terms of their friendships and environment, and instead are shunted between trainers, workplaces, and human employers. Far from being nurtured to develop their potential, these animals are molded into submission. Their agency isn't enabled, but suppressed in order to turn them into effective tools for crowd control, human entertainment, hippotherapy, or assistance to people with disabilities. In between the donkeys whose presence in the sheep pasture keeps predators at bay, and the seeing eye dog who undergoes months of intensive training in order to spend most of his life serving as a tool for others, we cross the line from use to exploitation. It is often difficult to know exactly when this line has been crossed, just as it is difficult to know the precise moment when someone crosses the line into baldness. But imprecision at the boundaries doesn't mean we cannot distinguish a full head of hair from a bald one. In general terms, that line is crossed when we bring domesticated animals into the community and then fail to treat them as full citizens. The problem is not that we benefit from animals, but that we almost always do so at their expense. Medical care/intervention. Recognizing domesticated animals as members of the community includes accepting their equal right to communal resources and the social basis of well-being, such as medical care. Today, farm and companion animals are subject to a great number of veterinary procedures and medications, most of which are not in their interest, but rather in the interests of humans who wish to make animals into more productive, compliant, or attractive entities. For example, growth hormones, castration, declawing, debeaking, debarking, tail and ear docking, and many others. Some interventions are rationalized as being for the good of the animal, for example, antibiotics for mastitis and other infections, debeaking of chickens who would otherwise harm each other. But of course, these problems are caused by the human abuse of animals in the first place, for example, overcrowding, stress, and inadequate diet, and so are hardly indicative of genuine concern for the well-being of community members. However, animals also receive a great deal of veterinary care that is genuinely in their interest, from vaccines to emergency care. The amount of money spent on health care for pets is often criticized as an example of misguided moral priorities. And indeed, there is something deeply perverse about the sacrifices many families make for their dogs' and cats' well-being, even as they happily participate in the abuse of farm animals. For some critics, spending on companion animal health care is simply a bad faith gesture by people who want to think of themselves as animal lovers, even as they support the horrors of livestock farming or animal experimentation. But even if the human motivation for providing health care to companion animals is hypocritical or inconsistent in this way, that in no way diminishes the claim of domesticated animals to health care. Health care is a right of membership in contemporary societies, and domesticated animals have the right to be treated as members. This explains why we have duties to provide health care to domestic dogs and cats, and not, or not always, to wolves or leopards in the wild. We will discuss our obligations to animals in the wild in Chapter 6. These duties would likely be fulfilled through some scheme of animal health insurance. However, there are difficult issues regarding the scope and nature of this obligation. For one thing, animals are not in a position to give informed consent to treatment, and so humans must make decisions on behalf of animals, much as parents do for children. While a paternalistic framework is unavoidable here, we should be open to the possibility that animals are able to communicate their wishes to us to some extent. For example, many animals are capable of understanding that a vet is trying to help them, even if in the short term a particular procedure is uncomfortable or painful, and so they willingly assent to the ministrations of the vet over the years. But imagine now that in her older years, a dog runs into chronic health problems, and at a certain point begins to actively resist trips to the vet and treatment. This should be a red flag that perhaps imposing treatment, even if it still has a good chance of being effective and giving her a few more months or years of life, is not her choice. Our best efforts at understanding what our animal companions would wish us to do will not significantly alter the basic paternalistic framework in which humans must decide what is right for their companions. Human adults, confronted with the prospect of invasive surgery followed by a lengthy period of discomfort and recovery, are able to understand what is happening to them, to anticipate their lives post-recovery. Animals are not, and so we should assume that the process is more frightening and stressful for them. An invasive surgery, which might be the right choice for a young animal with psychological resilience and years of potential life ahead, might not be the right choice for a timid and elderly dog who will be subject to terrifying interventions in exchange for a few more months of life. In the human case, there is much debate as to the ethics of euthanasia in the advanced stages of terminal illness. On one hand, it seems right to want to spare people unnecessary pain in the final hours or days of life, even if they are not in a position to consent to or to request intervention. On the other hand, there is a possibility that legalizing euthanasia will lead to abuses. In the case of domesticated animals, we see the term euthanasia used all the time for killings that have nothing to do with avoiding suffering in the last days of terminal illness. Animals are euthanized, so-called, simply because they are unwanted or abandoned, old, inconvenient, or expensive. However, the fact that most killing of domesticated animals is a terrible abuse does not mean that in a just society where domesticated animals are recognized as full citizens, that euthanasia would be completely prohibited. This means, like in the human case, it would be morally fraught and contested, and, if legal, tightly regulated. There are paradoxes here. Developments in veterinary care mean that many animals who might once have died of heart failure now have their heart condition successfully controlled by medication, adding months or years to their lives. However, rather than dying from a quick heart attack, this means that they are more likely to die from painful and prolonged conditions, such as kidney failure or brain tumors. Our various interventions, whether good like heart medications, or bad like allowing animals to eat too much or exercise too little, have implications for what their dying hours and days will be like. It is a very difficult question what our role should be at that stage: to comfort and ease pain as much as possible, or to hasten death and end suffering. Either way, we can't avoid responsibility for the decision, and given how contested this question is in the human instance, it is unlikely to be any less contested in the case of domesticated animals. Sex and reproduction. One of the most difficult issues facing any theory of animal rights, including a citizenship approach, concerns rights to reproduction. Humans exert enormous control over domesticated animals' sex and reproductive lives, whether they can do it, whether they may do it, and when, how, and with whom they may do it. Many abolitionist/extinctionist animal rights theorists rightly condemn this sort of pervasive interference in breeding and cite it as evidence of the ways that domestication inherently involves oppression. Yet, as we noted in Chapter 4, their own call for the extinction of domesticated species implicitly presupposes an equally systemic program of coercion and confinement in order to prevent domesticated animals from reproducing. If current practices force animals to reproduce in ways that serve human purposes, the abolitionist/extinctionist approach involves forcing animals not to reproduce. Neither of these approaches takes seriously the legitimate interests of domesticated animals. If anyone proposed this level of intervention into the sexual and reproductive lives of humans, it would be considered outrageous. But before confronting the question of what, if any, regulation by humans of the sex lives of domesticated animals is justified, it is helpful to consider briefly the human case and the case of animals living in the wild. In what ways are human sexuality and reproduction subject to regulation? On the one hand, it is very important for people to be able to have sex, if and when they want, with partners of their choosing, and to have a family if they wish. But it's not a free-for-all. We protect children from sexual exploitation and predation. We insist that sex be consensual. One's freedom to have sex is not absolute, but dependent on finding a willing partner. We require that people take responsibility for the children they produce. We carefully regulate which aspects of sex and reproduction can be subject to market forces, especially where children are concerned, for example, the sale of sperm, eggs, reproductive services, or adoption services. And we regulate the extent to which reproduction can be manipulated to produce specific outcomes. For example, we allow selective abortion to end pregnancies in the case of birth defects, but discourage it as a tool for sex selection. The use of fetal surgery to enhance certain capacities rather than simply correct abnormalities is another area of ethical debate. Many of these regulatory boundaries are highly contested. In general, we expect individuals to be self-regulating and responsible when it comes to engaging in sex and accepting its consequences. When they are unable to do so, the state intervenes, for example, to protect children, to protect unwitting partners from contracting HIV, or unwilling partners from sexual assault. There is no, quote, right to have partnered sex, unquote, as such, but rather a right to be free from sexual coercion or unwanted sexual regulation. And while most people would insist that we have a, quote, right to a family, unquote, a right which is enshrined in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this right depends on having a willing partner, or donor, or adoptee. There is obviously great contention about the extent of any right to have a family. How far is such a right constrained by a corresponding responsibility to be able to care for your offspring, or a responsibility not to reproduce in the case of societal overpopulation, or a responsibility to reproduce in the case of population collapse? Societies engage in extensive use of incentives and sometimes more coercive measures to encourage or discourage people from reproducing. Our sex and reproductive lives are in fact highly regulated, although the form that this regulation takes is largely internalized self-regulation and response to social pressures and incentives. Through self-regulation of reproduction, humans can theoretically ensure that their numbers don't exceed sustainable levels, or their individual and collective ability to care for the children they produce. Amongst animals in the wild, we see enormous diversity regarding the extent to which sex and reproduction are subject to social control and self-regulation. Amongst some species, almost all adult females mate and produce young. Often huge numbers of young are produced, and adults invest almost no energy in caring for them. The population is kept in check by predation, exposure, disease, and starvation. This is the evolutionary strategy of many fish and reptile species. The picture is very different among social species. Wolves are a fascinating example of a species that strictly regulates sexual and reproductive activity. In wolf clans, it is common for only the alpha male and female to have sex and produce young. Few cubs are born, and they are a heavy investment. The entire clan cooperates to raise the young of the alpha pair. Many adult wolves will go their entire lives without having sex. Wolves are self-regulating and socially regulating in this respect. Rather than the population being controlled by external forces, it is strictly regulated by the social group in response to context and available resources. When we turn to domesticated animals, it is important to remember that they belong to social species whose ancestors exerted some level of social control over reproduction and/or adult cooperation in the raising of young. However, human intervention has drastically disrupted these species' reproductive mechanisms, whether instinctual or learned. In other words, just as human intervention has made domesticated animals more dependent on humans to feed, shelter, and protect themselves from predators, it has also removed them from the mechanisms of population control that exist in the wild, a combination of self-regulation, social cooperation, and external controls. In recognizing domesticated animals as citizens, to the extent that autonomous control over their sexual and reproductive lives is possible for such animals, then we should seek to restore it. However, we can only foster agency where individuals are capable of agency, and domesticated animals vary considerably in the extent to which they might be capable of self-regulating with respect to sex and reproduction. We have removed domesticated animals from conditions in the wild in which their numbers would be regulated either by their own self-regulation in response to external pressures, similar to wolves, or directly by those external pressures in the form of predators, food shortages, etc. Starving to death or being eaten by a predator are not exercises of agency, and it would not be in the interests of domesticated animals to return to such conditions. But if such mechanisms are removed, then what replaces them? Given the opportunity to live in social communities in which they mix with others of their choosing, mate by choice, and raise their young, we don't know how they would regulate these activities. So part of what it means to recognize them as citizens is to experiment and learn about what animals would do if given greater control over their lives. However, this is not an excuse for humans to simply step out of the picture. To the extent that domesticated animals are unable to exercise meaningful agency, humans have a responsibility to act in their interests. As members of the community, domesticated animals are entitled to protection, including, where necessary, paternalistic protection. Moreover, to the extent that they are not internally self-regulating, they are subject to the constraints of social life, for example, to having regulation imposed on them in order to protect the basic rights of others and the sustainability of a scheme of cooperation. Here, as elsewhere, citizenship is a package that involves a mix of rights and responsibilities. As citizens, domesticated animals have rights, including rights not to have their sexual and reproductive activities unnecessarily curtailed, and the right to have their offspring cared for and protected by the larger mixed human-animal society. But as citizens, domesticated animals also have the responsibility to exercise their rights in ways that do not impose unfair or unreasonable costs on others, and that do not create unsustainable burdens on the scheme of cooperation. Where animals do not or cannot self-regulate their reproduction, the costs to others of having to care for and maintain their offspring could become prohibitive. In these circumstances, imposing some limits on their reproduction is, we believe, a reasonable element in a larger scheme of cooperation. As in the case of mobility restrictions, reproduction restrictions would need to be carefully justified and involve the least restrictive available methods. This justification is importantly different from the abolitionist call for universal birth control or sterilization, leading to extinction. Abolitionists would restrict the liberties of individual animals without reference to the interests of those animals. With the citizenship model, restrictions can only be justified by reference to the interests of the individual, while recognizing that these interests include being part of a cooperative social project, which involves both rights and duties. It is worth distinguishing the question of how domesticated animals reproduce from the question of how many such animals should exist. Currently, domesticated animals are the most populous mammals and birds on Earth by a long shot, so it would be hard to make a case that there should be more of them. Their numbers are unsustainable from an ecological point of view, as is likely the case for humans too. The only reason they exist in the numbers they do is because we intensively breed them to exploit them. So no matter what, the liberation of animals will bring about a great reduction in the number of domesticated animals. Presumably, we should head towards population sizes that are A, ecologically sustainable, and B, socially sustainable, i.e., they reflect some sort of balance between the human duty to care for domesticated animals and the way in which animals contribute to joint human-animal society. It is in the interest of domesticated animals that humans regulate their numbers in a sustainable fashion, rather than allowing the ravages of ecological or social collapse to do so instead. There are many relatively non-invasive ways in which we can control the reproductive rates of domesticated animals. Birth control vaccines, temporary physical separation, non-fertilization of chicken eggs, etc. Moreover, insofar as possible, we can impose birth control measures after animals have had a chance to have a family, if they seem inclined to do so. In other words, rather than the current situation in which some domesticated animals are designated breeders, while the vast majority never reproduce, the opportunity for having and raising young could be dispersed amongst most animals, but limited in scope. The fact that it is appropriate for us to control the overall numbers of domesticated animals, insofar as they are not socially self-regulating in this respect, does not mean that we need to control all aspects of this process. For example, choices about whether to have sex, with whom, and when. Again, we face tricky questions about the extent to which animals exercise agency in this regard. In The Hidden Life of Dogs, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas describes two strikingly different scenarios. In one, her dogs Maria and Misha, a strongly bonded and loving pair, clearly derive mutual pleasure and satisfaction from the sex act and the resulting pregnancy and puppies. On the other hand, her dog Viva is clearly traumatized when an unknown male dog jumps the fence into the yard and rapes her, and she proves to be a frightened and uncertain mother. The first scenario might count as one in which dogs in a secure context have an opportunity to exercise responsible agency. Human involvement plays a key role in creating the conditions for this exercise of agency, that is, by providing a stable and secure environment in which dogs can choose a mate, while protecting them from unwanted sexual advances. In other words, human involvement doesn't necessarily restrict agency, it may be crucial for enabling it. There are many unknowns here. For some species of domesticated animals, generations have been born through human-assisted insemination, to the extent that some animals cannot reproduce without assistance. We need to proceed cautiously when returning them to some control over the business of deciding if, when, and with whom to engage in the sex act. Our role should be guided by what is revealed about the extent to which, and conditions under which, they seem to exercise meaningful agency. In the meantime, we will undoubtedly continue to exercise a great deal of control over who breeds with whom. Even if we create circumstances in which animals can make many choices, we will still be controlling the pool of available partners and the likelihood of any given partnership leading to pregnancy and birth. This control should be exercised in ways that respect the rights of current animals and hopefully benefit future animals. For example, human breeding of animals has resulted in a wide array of health problems. Breathing problems, shortened lifespans, increased vulnerability to temperature extremes, flesh-to-bone ratios which mean that adult animals cannot support their own weight, and so on. Animals are incapable of making mating decisions to deliberately reverse these processes. We have removed them from the natural conditions in which evolutionary pressures define and select for fitness. Fitness for domesticated animals is what enables them to thrive in a mixed human-animal society. This means that humans, at least for the foreseeable future, need to exercise some control over breeding in the interests of domesticated animals. When providing an animal with a pool of possible partners, one of whom they might choose as a mate, humans should be selective about the pool in ways that benefit potential offspring in terms of their health and their capacities for flourishing in mixed society, based on animal citizenship rather than animal exploitation. This management of breeding can be justified if it is of benefit to future animals and operates under conditions that respect the rights of the breeding pair as to whether and when they can mate. Domesticated animal diets. Amongst our many duties to domesticated animals, we are responsible for ensuring that they have adequate nutrition. And here we encounter another dilemma. Do we have an obligation to feed meat to our domesticated animals, particularly if this is part of their so-called natural diet. Must we turn some animals into meat in order to fulfill our duties to our domesticated animal co-citizens? It is worth stepping back and considering the issue of animal diets more generally. Some domesticated animals, especially chickens, cows, goats, sheep, and horses, given greater scope for exercising agency, will be able to take care of many of their own nutritional needs. Earlier, we cited Rosamund Young's descriptions of how her free-roaming cows tailor their own feeding to eat a balanced diet, to deal with ailments, prepare for childbirth, and so on. Other animals, however, will be dependent on us to provide for their nutritional needs for the foreseeable future. Dog and cat companions have long been removed from a wild context in which they could adequately feed themselves through hunting and scavenging. Feral dogs and cats can often survive on their own, but they rarely thrive unless their diets are supplemented by humans. Indeed, dogs and cats are long adapted to living with human families and sharing their food. In recent decades, we have gotten used to the idea of specially prepared cat and dog foods. In part, this reflects a growing understanding that dogs and cats have different nutritional needs from humans. In part, it reflects a desire to find a market for the byproducts of an industrialized meat system. But for most of human pet history, dogs and cats have just eaten family leftovers and their own scroungings. Dogs especially have evolved to be highly flexible omnivores. There is ample evidence that dogs can thrive on a suitably planned vegan diet. There is growing evidence that cats, even though they are carnivores, can also thrive on high-protein vegan diets, suitably supplemented with taurine and other nutrients. If this is the case, then transition to a just human-animal world will not pose insurmountable moral dilemmas when it comes to feeding our animal companions. Critics will complain that a vegan diet is not natural for dogs and cats, but dogs and cats have been part of our world for centuries, adapting to a diversity of cultural diets, and there is nothing natural about commercial pet food. There is no natural diet for animal companions. What matters for them is to have a diet that meets all their nutritional needs and which is palatable and pleasing to them. Cats and dogs have individual tastes, but there is plenty of evidence of their partiality to many vegan foods and palate enhancers. For example, nutritional yeast, sea vegetables, and simulated meat, fish, and cheese flavors. It is probable that even if a vegan diet can be nutritional and tasty, it wouldn't be the first choice of many cats and dogs. Given the option, they would probably go for the meat. We have made a point of enabling animal agency, allowing them to make choices about their own good when this is possible. So why, in the case of diet, are we advocating that meat should not be among the choices offered to them? Because the liberty of citizens is always constrained by respect for the liberties of others. Dog and cat members of a mixed human-animal society do not have the right to food that involves the killing of other animals. As we discuss in Chapter 6, predator-prey relationships are a necessity for animals in the wild, but domesticated animals are citizens of a mixed human-animal society in which the circumstances of justice do exist. Justice requires acknowledging the rights of domesticated animals, as we have been emphasizing repeatedly, but it also requires that domesticated animals, like all citizens, respect the basic liberties of all. Many humans too would prefer to eat meat, but given the availability of nutritional alternatives, it would be unethical to do so. However, what if it turns out some cats simply cannot be adequately nourished without animal protein in their diet? How could we fulfill our duty to feed cats without violating the rights of other animals not to be killed? Possible options include 1. Letting cats hunt, 2. Scavenging corpses for them, 3. Inventing Franken meat grown from stem cells, or 4. Letting cats eat eggs supplied by domesticated chickens. The first option, that is, letting cat companions prey on mice and birds, is not much better than killing the birds and mice ourselves. Cat companions are part of our community, and this means that insofar as we are able, we need to limit their ability to inflict violence on other animals, just as we would inhibit our children from doing so. In other words, part of our responsibility as members of a mixed human-animal society is to impose regulation on members who are unable to self-regulate when it comes to respecting the basic liberties of others. For example, by putting bells on cats to warn mice and birds that they are approaching, and by supervising them out of doors. The option of scavenging corpses, for example, acquiring meat from animals who die of old age or in accidents on roads, raises interesting questions. Showing dignity to corpses is one of the ways in which we mark respect. Some would argue that since animals are incapable of understanding the idea of disrespecting corpses, it is not possible to undermine their dignity by the way we treat their bodies after death. The idea that respectful relations can only exist between persons who understand the concept of respect has been challenged by disability theorists who argue that respect can inhere in the relationship between two people, even if it is not part of the self-understanding of one of them. Lack of respect, even if it is not understood that way by the person who is not respected, can have serious implications for how they are treated, and whether they are truly perceived as full members of the community. This conception of respect may have implications for the treatment of animal corpses. If we have a different standard in general for the treatment of animal corpses than for human corpses, this marks both a different level of respect and perpetuates an inability to see them as full members of the community. Therefore, we need to be careful about what it means to allow animal corpses to be treated differently from human corpses. On the other hand, our ideas of respecting human corpses are culturally variable and subject to change over time. Performing autopsies, using human bodies for scientific research, transplanting organs, all of these practices were once seen as examples of subjecting corpses to indignity. New technologies for composting human bodies are controversial for the same reason. Is it okay to recycle human bodies as fertilizer? There is another question here about whether the treatment of corpses belongs to the realm of basic rights concerning all individuals, or is it a right associated with citizenship that marks the boundaries of a community and the duties of members towards each other? It seems to operate at both levels. On the one hand, there are some kinds of interference with human corpses, things we should refrain from doing, which are probably universally recognized as acts of contempt or disrespect. On the other hand, ideas about our positive obligations to corpses, what we should do to show respect, are culturally and religiously variable, marking the boundaries of a community. This could mean that while there are some ways in which we should never treat bodies, human, animal, citizen, or foreigner, there are special obligations we owe to members of the community. For example, if a human dies in a foreign land, it may be more appropriate to repatriate the body, or to treat it in accordance with the culture, religion, community to which the person belonged, rather than the culture in which they happened to be a visitor. Perhaps then we ought to treat the bodies of domesticated animals the same way as human bodies in any given society or community, but the same obligation does not apply for the corpses of those from outside the community. It may be appropriate to treat the corpse of my cat companion in a way that marks her citizenship in a shared human-animal society, while it may be inappropriate to do so with a wild animal. The wild animal belongs to a different society, in which there is nothing undignified about dead bodies being scavenged and recycled this way through the web of life. Does this mean that it would therefore be acceptable for us to scavenge those bodies to feed our cats? Or would this inevitably lead to a cheapening of wild animal life in our eyes? Concerns about how we treat corpses, and how this may compromise our respect for the living, bring us to related concerns about the invention of frankenmeats, that is, meat grown in labs from stem cells. On the one hand, this kind of development seems to offer a potential end run around the problems of meat consumption. The idea is that no sentient being is being created, just tissue. Thus, nobody is directly harmed by the creation of this meat. One concern, however, is that such a development would have spillover effects in terms of respect for the living. If animal stem cells, but not human ones, are used to grow frankenmeat, does this not mark a crucial difference in terms of the dignity of persons? It seems unlikely we would grow meat for consumption from human stem cells. This would violate the taboo against cannibalism that says humans aren't for eating. But in that case, would it not be a similar violation to eat flesh grown from animal stem cells? For some vegans, even the idea of simulated meats or fur or leather is disgusting. For others, these products are unproblematic. Issues of disgust are bound up with issues of respect, and reasonable people will no doubt continue to disagree about the appropriate boundaries. The possibility of feeding cats non-meat animal protein, like eggs, obviously depends on whether there are any conditions under which it is ethical to use chickens to provide these foods within human-animal society. We discussed this issue earlier, and concluded that there are limited circumstances in which it is acceptable to do so. However, a commercial industry in egg or milk products is probably not viable and would invite abuse, and so there can be no mass production to solve the problem of animal protein for cats. However, it could be that for people who want to live with cat companions, part of the deal, as it were, is that they might need to find an ethical source of eggs, perhaps by keeping their own chicken companions as well. Cats are the only true carnivores amongst domesticated animals, and thus pose a unique challenge in human-animal society. There may be no way for humans to have cat companions without dealing with a certain level of moral complexity regarding their diet and other restrictions necessary for them to be part of human-animal society. Such restrictions are not just diet-related, but involve carefully monitoring cats outdoors to protect other animals from their predatory activities. Does this level of restriction undermine the possibility of cats being flourishing members of mixed society? Does it mean that we would be justified in bringing about their extinction? At the very least, it means that any individual human contemplating having a companion cat is signing on for a great deal of responsibility in terms of doing the work to ensure their cat flourishes under necessary restrictions. For example, efforts to find palatable and nutritionally appropriate foods for them, and to create opportunities for them to enjoy the outdoors while not endangering others. Political representation. We have emphasized the way in which citizenship offers a perspective on individual freedom and flourishing, which understands how these unfold within the cooperative and reciprocal project of social life. This requires that individuals internalize the basic rules of social life, for example, not violating the rights of others and participating in social life, in order to enjoy its freedoms and opportunities. But the basic rules are always provisional, subject to ongoing negotiation through the democratic participation of all citizens. We have also emphasized that domesticated animals have the capacity to participate in this process if assisted by those collaborators who have learned how to interpret their expressions of preference. But this sort of dependent agency is only going to be effective politically if there are institutional mechanisms that link domesticated animals and their collaborators to political decision makers. In short, we need some way to ensure the effective political representation of domesticated animals. Obviously, this will not be through extending the vote to domesticated animals, since animals are not capable of understanding the political platforms of different candidates or political parties. This is also true of many people with severe intellectual disabilities, and, as Vorhaus notes, they too need a conception of representation that is not defined by or exhausted by the right to vote. How then should we think about political representation for animal co-citizens? Little has been written on this within the animal rights theory literature, reflecting the priority on negative rights and the assumption that the future of human-animal relations is one of minimal contact, not social and political integration. However, there is a related debate within the environmental literature on how to, quote, enfranchise nature, unquote. Robin Eckersley, for example, has recommended the constitutional entrenchment of an independent public authority, such as an environmental defender's office, with responsibility for ensuring that the interests of future generations and non-human species are taken into account in decision-making. Similar proposals for creating political offices of environmental advocates, trustees, or ombudsmen have been discussed by other authors, although critics argue that in the end, the only reliable way of ensuring that the interests of either future generations or non-human species are taken into account is to change attitude amongst the general human electorate. As we noted, these proposals have not emerged from within the animal rights theory literature, but from within the green/ecology literature. And as reflects the priorities of that literature, these proposals have rarely focused on the idea of defending even the basic rights of domesticated animals, let alone their citizenship status. The focus, rather, has been on preserving the sustainability of ecosystems, primarily in the wild, a commitment which, as we have seen in Chapter 2, has often gone hand in hand with endorsing the violation of the rights of individual animals, for example, through support for sustainable hunting or the therapeutic culling of overpopulated or invasive species. From a more specifically animal rights perspective, There is an intriguing example of the office of animal advocate within the Swiss canton of Zurich. A lawyer with the power to represent animals in court, and with the mandate to focus on animal well-being rather than environmental sustainability. But this is more about ensuring the effective enforcement of existing legal protections against cruelty and harm than about political representation. The animal advocate is not authorized to renegotiate the terms of membership by representing animals as co-citizens in legislative processes. As these examples make clear, what matters in the end is not the creation of this or that institutional mechanism, an ombudsman rather than a defender, for example, but rather the underlying picture of human-animal relations that drives the institutional reform. After all, there is already a well-established system of animal welfare officers in most jurisdictions, but their role is tightly circumscribed by the underlying welfarist philosophy that takes it for granted that animals exist to serve human ends, and that animal welfare therefore consists only in eliminating unnecessary animal suffering. To get out of this trap, we need to first clarify the goals of any new scheme of representation, which we have argued should be built around the idea of co-citizenship for domesticated animals. Effective representation within this scheme will require institutional reforms at any number of levels. It will involve representation in the legislative process, but it will also require representing animals in, for example, municipal land planning decisions, or on the governance boards of various professions and public services, police, emergency services, medicine, law, urban planning, social services, etc. In all of these institutions, domesticated animals have been rendered invisible and their interests ignored. Section 5. Conclusion. This is just a partial list of the sorts of changes that are entailed by thinking about domesticated animals as co-citizens. We hope that these examples give some indication of how the citizenship perspective works, and how it differs from both the abolitionist/extinctionist and threshold views that currently dominate animal rights theory. It's important to note that the core of the citizenship model, in our view, is not a static list of rights or responsibilities, but rather the commitment to constructing certain kinds of ongoing relations that embody ideals of full membership and co-citizenship. We examine issues of animal training and socialization, animal products and labor, animal health care and reproduction, by asking what sorts of provisions and safeguards uphold the status of domesticated animals as full members of a mixed human-animal society, and which ones operate to erode that status, turning animals into a permanently subordinated caste. On all of the issues, thinking about domesticated animals as co-citizens does not provide a magic formula that resolves all of our moral dilemmas without remainder. As in the human case, what is required by respect for co-citizenship will be a matter of contestation and reasonable disagreement. But we have argued that thinking in these terms does clarify the goals and safeguards that should guide our judgments, and helps us avoid the dead ends and contradictions that afflict existing approaches within animal rights theory. Moreover, this approach helps make some sense of the seeming paradoxes of our current treatment of animals. One hears the criticism that human society goes overboard in its treatment of pampered domesticated animals, such as cats and dogs, and this treatment is sentimental, hypocritical, and self-indulgent. The criticism has two aspects. First, it notes the hypocrisy of paying for an expensive cancer treatment for Rover while sitting down to a dinner of pork chops or chicken wings. The second criticism is not comparative, but absolutist. It simply holds that animal companions are neither deserving nor appropriate objects of this level of care. They're just animals after all. We don't dispute the perversity of our current treatment of domesticated animals, but we think that these two criticisms are miscast. On the first, a citizenship approach says that the appropriate response to hypocrisy is not to reduce the level of care that we give to companion animals, but rather to treat all domesticated animals as citizens, with the full benefits and responsibilities of membership. On the second, a citizenship approach asserts the fundamental equality of all members of a community. Equal concern and respect for all citizens is not a sentimental indulgence, but a matter of justice. The love and care that many humans direct to their animal companions is not misdirected sentiment to be despised, but a powerful moral force to be harnessed and expanded.